We'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance led by Commissioner McNinch.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Suzanne, would you call the roll of the commission, please? Here.
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 Would the County Advisory Board members please stand and announce themselves? Thank you and welcome. Move to agenda item number 2, approval of the agenda. Chairman Wallace for possible action. The commission will review the agenda and may take action to approve the agenda. The commission may remove items from the agenda, continue items for consideration, or take items out of order. Has everyone had a chance to review the agenda? I just have one item that on tomorrow's agenda, agenda item number 24. I would like to see agenda item number 24 at the call of the chair to accommodate some plane schedules for presenters. This is an action item. I'll take it out for public comment in Carson City. Seeing none, public comment in Las Vegas.
No comment, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I'll bring it back to the commission and Director Wasley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Agenda item number 23 may also have a time constraint. We have a presentation as part of that by a USGS scientist that has some constraints late in the afternoon. It may be, if possible, to move that perhaps between what's currently number 19 and 20 before the informational reports or at the call of the chair.
Questions from the commission? Commissioner McNinch?
No questions.
No questions? Okay. All right, do I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to approve the agenda as presented, except that items 23 and 24 be at the call of the chair.
Second.
I have a motion by Commissioner McNinch with a second by Vice Chairman Johnston to approve the agenda as presented with the exception of agenda items 23 and 24 be at the call of the chair. Questions on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously 9-0. Moving on to agenda item number 3, member items, announcements, and correspondence. Chairman Wallace, informational. Commissioners may present emergent items. No action may be taken by the commission. Any item requiring commission action may be scheduled on a future commission agenda. The commission will review and may discuss correspondence sent or received by the commission since the last regular meeting and may provide copies for the exhibit file. Commissioners may provide hard copies of their correspondence for the written record. Correspondence sent or received by Secretary Wasley may also be discussed. Member items? Seeing none, Director Wasley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did receive some correspondence. The correspondence that I received, as usual, is forwarded to the full body. There was one particular email that I received from Mike Laughlin. It contained a photo of former Commissioner Raines with his 2 boys, and there was a specific request in this email for it to be read into the minutes of the next commission meeting, which is this meeting. The message that Mr. Laughlin wished to convey is that without mule deer to hunt for the younger generation of Nevada hunters, hunting as we know it will die. You know me, Tony, this is important, and I wish to have this read into the minutes of the next commission meeting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Director Wasley. Any further member items? Seeing none, we'll close agenda item number 3, move to agenda item number 4. County Advisory Boards to manage wildlife member items, informational. CAB members may present emergent items. No action may be taken by the commission. Any item requiring commission action will be scheduled on a future commission agenda. Come on up, Paul.
For the record, Paul Dixon Clark. At my cab several months ago, we had discussed muzzleloader handguns, and I had brought that forward to the commission. And at this last cab meeting, the Clark County Cab wanted to ask the commission to consider in the Department of Wildlife of having a board member from my board, Mr. Joseph Donnelly, the person who brought forward muzzleloader handguns, as well as somebody from NDOW, work together to put together draft language. And that draft language could be combined in part or whole with draft language that we have currently under regulation consideration for the open NAC. But I'd like to see at least the draft language get put in so that muzzleloader handguns could be used during the muzzleloader season. It seems logical. Should be pretty straightforward. Of the 4 items that are currently open in that NAC, there was cartridge length, there was automatic, electronic triggers, and a couple other things. I think the only thing that was really controversial in that open regulation right now was the cartridge length with the NRA. And I would like this board to consider maybe combining the muzzleloader handgun plus the controversial items and see if we can get that through, and then work the cartridge length at a different time, because that seems to be the controversial thing, and not hold up logical regulation in self-sighting scopes, electronic triggers, and muzzleloader handguns as examples. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dixon. Further CAB items? Seeing none, we'll close agenda item number 4. Move to agenda item number 5, approval of the minutes. Chairman Wallace for possible action. Commission minutes may be approved from the September 22nd, 23rd, 2017 meetings. Has the commission had a chance to review the minutes? Questions or corrections? Commissioner Allmark.
Yes, on page 45, I want to make sure that it's understood that my comments and beliefs were based on discussions at the commission and White Pine County CAB. I was not contacted personally or independently by White Pine Lincoln or Elko.
Thank you, Commissioner Allmark. Further commission comments? Commissioner Allmark, is there a particular way you would like that to read in the minutes? Okay. Your microphone's not on. Well, apparently it's not working. There it is.
I'm sorry, what, did you miss, Suzanne? Yeah, I couldn't hear you at all? Okay, I'll say that over again. On page 45, bottom of there, Commissioner Allmark said Elko, Lincoln, and White Pine counties have all contacted him regarding the commission enacting a shed antler regulation before spring of 2018. My comments and my beliefs were based on discussions at the commission and White Pine County CAB meetings. I was not contacted by White Pine County, even though I talked about Lincoln County's commissioners, but that was, again, discussion through the CAB meeting. That commissioner did not contact me, and I just want to make sure that that was clear, that I was not contacted directly by Elko, Lincoln, or White Pine County.
Further commission comments? Seeing none, this is an action item. We'll take it out for public comment on agenda item number 5, approval of the minutes. We'll start in Las Vegas.
No public comment, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Public comment in Carson City. Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission for a motion. Commissioner McNinch.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as presented with the notation or the adjustment, the revisions per Commissioner Allenberg.
I have a motion by Commissioner McNinch and a second by Commissioner Allenberg to approve the minutes as presented with the following corrections presented by Commissioner Allenberg. Questions on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously, 9-0. Move to agenda item number 6. Commission General Regulation 475, Shed Antlers, Chief Game Warden Tyler Turnipseed, workshop, public comment allowed. The Commission will hold a workshop to consider regulation relating to amending Chapter 503 of the Nevada Administrative Code. This regulation prohibits a person from collecting shed antlers at any time during a year unless the shed antlers are collected by the person from the field April 15th to December 31st, inclusive of that year. Chief Turnipseed.
Thank you, Chairman Wallace, members of the Commission, Chief Game Warden Tyler Turnipseed for the record. The issue at hand here is shed antler collection, and as you guys may remember, this issue has been batted around off and on for at least 10 years that I'm aware of, if not longer, probably more like 12. But the current language was actually passed by this board in 2014, and then made it up to the Legislative Commission, who then chose to not pass that final round of approvals because there was a senator on that Legislative Commission who asked for a private lands exemption to be put into it, using the example of his granddaughter picking up an antler on his own property. So we brought it back, drafted what that private land exemption language would look like, but then it was never back on this agenda at this board again until now. So that particular regulation expired, but bringing it back again this time with the same language. We don't have the private lands exemption in there because thought it might be up for discussion about what that would look like and what that would say. But so I've got a brief PowerPoint here if I can figure out how to get it to go to slideshow. Chat, how do I get that to the actual slideshow rather than just scrolling? Just scroll. All right, so some of the background here. Of course, this is a PowerPoint that I sort of renewed from 2012, but and put some current stuff in it. So obviously, shed antlers have kind of exploded in popularity over the last 6 or 8 years in terms of popularity of people going out and shed hunting. You know, 20 years ago, it was a small handful of people who did this as a hobby, but over recent years, it's exploded in popularity, leading to pictures like this with the commercial aspect of them. The commercial aspect, this last year, brown elk antlers were selling for about $14 a pound, from what I saw. So, you know, one mature set of bull elk antlers that are fresh brown, looking at a couple $100 for that one pair of antlers. So there's certainly a commercial aspect here that has expanded. Here's an example from several years ago of an antler chandelier that's going for $8,500. That's actually a 2011 photo, so I suspect that would be in 5 digits now. So part of the demand for the popularity of this is just the excitement of going out and doing it. I myself am a shed hunter. It's addicting, sort of the world's biggest Easter egg hunt. But then the commercial aspect of it certainly is providing a bigger draw now too. Some of the impacts we've discussed over the years would basically be that with the glut of people hitting the shed antler or hitting the winter ranges, from January through April basically would be primarily displacing those animals off of their critical winter range into something that's a little bit less desirable as far as forage quality and winter range quality. You know, with all that activity, OHVs, all that sort of stuff, precluding wildlife from the area altogether. And then we've talked in, we've all heard the mule deer presentation about the the fuel tank of energy reserves. And each time, that time of year that those deer get bumped or elk get bumped, they a little bit less gas in the tank. And then if they're off of that critical deer to winter range, it's harder to replace that energy reserve when they're getting bumped day in and day out. Off-road travel is a piece of it. You know, with the some habitat issues, we'll show some photos of that. And then occasionally we actually hear of people pushing animals trying to get them to drop. We did have a case this last year in northern Lander County of where we witnessed somebody pushing deer with a four-wheeler. Those people were cited, and that case is pending. But big part that we see, this is an antler hunter just gridding out a whole alluvial fan, up one ridge, down one draw, up one ridge, down one draw, leaving ATV tracks wherever they go, and of course moving those animals off of where they're going to be. Same thing here, a couple guys on four-wheelers, clearly way off-road, pile of antlers on the front of the one four-wheeler, looks like, taken from a ways away in a spotting scope. And then, as I said, the off-road travel here, I think this is in western Elko County or southwest Elko County, and you can see it's in a burn area, so you take the brush off and it makes it real easy to drive a truck all over that, or four-wheeler or UTV. Same thing here, this one was taken in central Nevada. This four-wheeler track is probably 4 or 5 miles from a road, just you know, pushing into country looking for antlers. Reaching back a little ways, we wanted to get a little more of a handle on this. This goes back to 2008, so obviously not super current, but I thought it was still relevant. We planned several special operations of patrols, sort of a saturation patrol with several wardens looking at Lincoln and White Pine counties over 2 or 3 weekends. We led up ahead of it with radio spots, sort of some educational, informational type stuff. Brought out the OGT trailer with the, you know, sort of to use as a unit watch base, and handed out flyers and T-shirts and all that sort of stuff. The flyer here that we handed out about the do's and don'ts of hunting shed antlers responsibly. One item of note here is that that project we figured with travel time and per diem, that project cost us about $28,000, which is noteworthy just because antler hunters, for the most part, don't bring any revenue into the state. We assume that Nevada shed hunters probably already have a hunting license anyway, but the out-of-state antler hunters, it could be assumed that a lot of them don't purchase a license. That project that year, in 2008, of the 247 people contacted, 25% of them were from out of state, 37% were actually in their home county, and then another 38% were from Nevada but out of their home county. I think that chart would look a lot different this last year when Utah closed theirs down, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So some of the statutes that are already on the books that would apply here, like I'd mentioned, we had the case in Lander County last year of people running deer with a four-wheeler, and this is the statute that applies there. It talks, basically says it's unlawful to molest, rally, stir up, or drive any game mammals or game birds with an aircraft, helicopter, or motor-driven vehicle. So that comes into play with an ATV, doesn't apply to people on foot or horseback or anything, just motorized vehicles. So again, we've made a couple of these cases over the years, but it's tough to be in that right place at the right time to find this happening and then make that burden of proof to prove that that's what they were doing and had some intent to do it. Fast forward to 2011, the legislature that year passed a new statute, a new law that basically mandated this commission to adopt regulations for the taking of shed antlers. This commission, in my opinion, met that by passing the regulation in 2014, but then, like I said, it failed to pass that final round of approvals at the Legislative Commission. What was discussed in 2014 and 2015 as possible components of a shed regulation were season dates, times that people shouldn't be out collecting sheds, education requirements. Utah has an online ethical shed hunting course that a person has to take if they're going to hunt antlers during the springtime of the year. 19,000 people took that test last year in Utah, to give you an idea of the numbers. Some of the other things that were discussed 3 years ago were limits, commercial antler collectors versus recreational. I think a lot of people wanted to draw the line there of somebody who's doing it for a living or for supplemental income versus someone who's out doing it on a weekend with their kids or whatever and more as a recreational shed hunter. The problem that we discussed 3 years ago on that, of course, was that when you contact a shed hunter in the field, there's no way to know whether that's someone who's going to make $15,000 selling antlers, or if it's, you know, somebody out for the day to enjoy the outdoors. There's really no way to differentiate that, because most antler hunters, of course, collect antlers all through the spring, and then early summer, antler buyer comes through and they sell those then. So really no way to differentiate there. And then there was discussion about open and closed units or open and closed counties, because of course the bulk of this problem happens on the eastern side of the state. The three cabs that brought this issue forward again this time, and I think brought it forward last time, were Lincoln, White Pine, and Elko, which is understandable because those three counties have the most severe winters, the most concentrated winter ranges, and the biggest, most populous herds of big game animals. So it's that was part of the discussion 3 years ago was, does the western side of the state need this regulation, where the western side of the state has easier winters, fewer big game animals, and less concentrated winter ranges. For comparison, some of the other states' shed antler laws and regulations, Montana is a little bit unique in that a lot of their critical winter range, their department has purchased in their state wildlife management areas, and actually closed those to all human activity. No hikers, no bikers, no antler hunters, no nothing, from January 1st to May 15th. So then they have an opening day race on the first morning where there's the big stampede of people going out across the valley to hit the antlers on May 16th. Colorado, they've done it on a localized basis. The Gunnison Basin, their antler hunting is closed from January 1st to March 15th in the Gunnison Basin area where the winters are severe. They have winter kill problems. Those deer in the Gunnison Basin kind of get trapped by the basin there, and they're prone to having deep snow and a lot of below zero temperatures for months at a time. And I thought this was interesting. After May 15th, they have hours where you can't hunt antlers before 10 a.m. and then you can only go till sunset. It's the only state I know of who's doing something about hours. Wyoming kind of splits their state in half. West of the Continental Divide, antler hunting is closed from January 1st to April 30th. East of the Continental Divide, no restrictions, no seasons, no nothing. Utah, I mentioned this one. Shed collectors are required to take an online class yearly if collecting sheds between February and April. That number surprised me a little bit, that last year they had 19,000 people take that online course to hunt antlers during that time of year. Then part of what brought this issue up to being urgent again was that we had a severe winter last year in parts of the state. Utah had a severe winter, and as emergency action, they closed their antler hunting on February 3rd statewide through the end of March. Of course, with 19,000 people having taken that antler hunting class, a lot of those 19,000 looked for where they were going to go shed hunt since Utah closed it. A lot of those people came to Nevada. So this is a picture from Lincoln County. That's the Patterson Pass parking area. It was completely full of RVs, most of which had Utah plates. Just a glut of people. We had people getting antlers stolen out of their yards in Lincoln County, and just all up and down the eastern side of the state. Our wardens and the local people remarked that they were just inundated with antler hunters. Same thing. Here's Patterson Pass parking lot. So that's kind of a summary of where we've been on this issue, where we could go forward, and I'd stand for questions.
Questions for Chief Turnipseed? Commissioner Barnes?
Tyler, the one question that I have to begin with, and you mentioned it, was a private land exemption. Because in discussions I've had with owners, and we have the same thing, is that a lot of these animals come in around our hay corrals at night, and they'll lose their horns right there in the hay corral, and the next morning you go to get your hay and they're laying right there on the ground, and in some cases they'll actually be stuck in the hay. And so, you got to pick them up and move them. Is there be something there, so, because if I show up and pick one up, am I going to be breaking the law? Or,
yeah, I think there's definitely room to, Chief Turnipseed for the record again, I definitely think there's room for a private lands exemption in here. The way we wrote it last time, so the regulation is short and sweet. I should have put it in the PowerPoint, but the regulation just says a person shall not collect shed antlers at any time during a year unless the shed antlers are collected by the person from the field from April 15th to December 31st inclusive of that year. When we imagined what a private lands exemption would look like, it was literally only a couple words that said, basically exempted private land. And obviously it would be up to this board. There was some discussion as to whether it would just be a blanket exemption for, the regulation doesn't apply to private land, period, or the regulation doesn't apply to the landowners or their immediate families on that private land. That would certainly be up to the appetite of this body, whether it was an exemption for private land, period, or an exemption for that landowner on his or her own private land.
And I don't mean to really confuse this, but you do bring up a good point. If you make an exemption over all private land, there's some parts of northern Elko County that there's a lot of areas of private land that, they're big areas. And then you could have the problem of really commercializing that, and really, as far as I don't want to say harassing animals, as far as animal movement, we could still have that potential. So I think when if we do make some kind of exemption, like you say, maybe the family members or not to be actively shed hunting, or if we could put some kind of language in there.
Yeah, it presents a little bit of an interesting dilemma, because I think we as a department, and I assume you guys as a board, don't want to interfere with private property rights. I suspect there's an authority issue of whether we even have the authority to regulate shed antlers on private property. But you're right, there's a lot of private property, especially like I think of big tracts of private property in places that would be good for antler hunting, and I think of like the checkerboard through the Pequops and some of that stuff in Elko County that becomes even more confusing because it's checkerboarded for miles, and if it were a blanket private land exemption, how hard is it to enforce, or the corner hopping question and all that sort of stuff in that checkerboard and all through the private.
Further questions from the commission? Commissioner Allenberg.
Yes, Tyler, could you clarify for me? Last time we couldn't do an emergency closure or anything like that because when Utah closed theirs because of this was in limbo. Could you update us on the status if that was an option for us now, if another state closed their season and we were worried about that influx of people? Could we address it on an emergency basis?
You bet. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner Allenberg. Chief Turnipseed again. It's a great question, and I think we have the authority, and the Deputy Attorney General may jump in here if I'm not getting it quite right, but we do have the authority to pass emergency regulations in terms of a CR being a commission regulation, like when Wild Horse Reservoir was about to go dry, and this board lifted the limit there so that people could come get those fish. That was basically an emergency action for a CR. But since we don't have anything in NAC or in statute about antler hunting or antler seasons, I think it actually takes NAC change to get there, unless we came up with an NAC that gave authority to the commission to set seasons for antlers as a commission regulation. I think that would be, there are two options, two routes to go there. One with an NAC change as this proposed here that just says, the season's gonna be closed from this date to this date and set that in administrative code. The other option would be, I assume we could do this like, just like any other upland bird season or deer season or whatever, that the NAC gives the commission authority to set that in commission regulation each year or in a 2-year process. Am I off base there on that? That would be the other option if it weren't in NAC, that it could be a CR.
Brian Stockton, Senior Deputy Attorney General for the record. So there's a lot of things that go into that. The Nevada Revised Statutes has an exception from the Nevada Administrative Procedures Act for commission regulations on seasons and bag limits. Whether we can extend seasons and bag limits to shed antler hunting is not clear to me at this point. And emergency regulations, to get an emergency regulation in, it has to be approved by the governor. Essentially, the governor has to say, yes, there's an emergency, this regulation has to be put in place immediately. And they have I didn't look it up, but they have a limited time span that they can be effective. and then you have to go into the regular process for regulations. So we'll try to look at that and see if we can fit shed antlers into the statutory exception for seasons and bag limits, but that's what allows the commission to adopt regulations without going through the whole regulation process for seasons and bag limits, because there's a specific exemption for those from the NRS 233B, which is the Administrative Procedures Act. So the answer is maybe. So.
Yeah, Chief Game Warden Turnipseed again, I think it's a definite maybe on being able to do it in CR, but it seems like it would be a lot clearer and more concise and a cleaner way to do it, to just put it in NAC.
Vice Chairman Johnston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief Game Warden Turnipseed, was there any, or do you know what the rationale was for the hours limitation in Colorado? I mean, I have some hunches of what the rationale might have been. I just wondered if you had any information on that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairman Johnston. I don't know. I would speculate that it's, you know, the early morning hours when those deer are down lower on the benches and temperatures are cold. You know, I know Gunnison is prone to being 20 below pretty regularly. So I assume it's just, you know, maybe when the deer have moved off of the lower land a little bit during the day and maybe gone to bed up in the trees, that kind of thing. But again, that's purely speculation. I didn't ask them their rationale for the hours. I thought that was interesting.
Commissioner East.
Thank you. Chief Turnipseed, I have a couple of questions, and they may be irrelevant because I'm new, so just bear with me. How are you monitoring this now, and are you recommending increased measures? What's that look like?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner East. We're not documenting it in any official way. You know, certainly we're patrolling during those times of year, especially this last year when we had the big glut of people who came in from Utah. We have a warden in Lincoln County, 2 in White Pine, and then of course a handful of wardens in Elko County, and everything they told me, of course it was anecdotal as far as you know, documenting any statistics, but they all said, man, we just are getting pounded by antler hunters. But as far as specific numbers or a way to track that, we don't have anything. And that kind of comes back to that license argument in that we really have no way of knowing what the numbers are like. You know, we can't tell you if we had 5,000 shed hunters or 50,000 shed hunters because there's no device to track them other than anecdotal information from a game warden saying, hey, I saw 5 camps here and saw, you know, checked 13 ATVs on Patterson Pass. You know, it's pretty, anecdotal's not the word, but not compiled in any measurable way.
So out of season, there's no type of fine or enforcement that would happen?
Correct. Right now, we really have no laws to enforce on it other than if we actually see them chasing animals with an ATV, then that statute about harassing comes into play. But beyond that, we really have nothing to enforce. Some of the land management agencies, BLM and Forest Service, you know, they have some things they could enforce as far as off-road travel in wilderness areas, wilderness study areas, and in BLM districts that have a travel management plan. But enforcement is fairly light on that. Okay. You know, they don't have a lot of law enforcement officers, even fewer than we do, and I rarely ever hear of them doing much antler enforcement.
Okay, one more question then. Would you recommend the online class like Utah has then for a license?
I think it's a good idea. I'd have to talk to Utah and see if they've had any luck with it improving ethical behavior. I guess it's not part of today's agenda item, so that's noteworthy. But yeah, I think it points out to people things they should and shouldn't be doing when they're antler hunting, like ATVs and pushing deer and you know, leaving them alone when they're in deep snow and that kind of stuff.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Vice Chairman Johnston.
Is Utah's education requirement for all shed antler hunters or just for those who do it at certain periods of time? Because I thought the Utah education requirements was for those people who went out to gather shed antlers at certain periods of time during the calendar year.
Exactly right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairman Johnston. Yeah, if you're hunting after April, then you don't need to take their class. If you're hunting from February through April, then you do have to have that class and have the little card that you took the online class if you're contacted out shed hunting.
And 19,000 people took the class?
19,000 people took the class, and then in an emergency measure, they closed it on the third day of that those season dates. Closed it. Initially, they closed it just in a handful of hunt areas or counties that were having severe weather, but then the other counties said, "Whoa, hey!" All of a sudden, we just got inundated with people. So a couple days later, they just did the blanket closure for the whole state.
And then going back to the public-private land distinction, I take it one way to word the regulation would be to prohibit the collection of shed antlers on public lands rather than trying to create a carve-out for private lands.
Yeah, that might make the language cleaner, correct?
And then I guess the private landowner would still have to grant access to collectors. Maybe I'm getting beyond questions. I'm not so certain private landowners are just going to open the gates to anybody and everybody to engage in the conduct we see here. I just don't think that's going to happen, because whatever they might get in return for that access is going to be de minimis compared to the potential effects they see on the landscape. So,
yeah, I think that would maybe come down to the question of, does that landowner limit access on their property to begin with? You know, is it posted versus somebody who has a 40 or a 160 out, you know, somewhere surrounded by BLM land that they don't control trespass on at all. It was interesting to note, I asked Wyoming and Utah both if their closures, if they gave a private lands exemption, and they were opposite. Wyoming did. Their closure only applied to public land. Utah didn't. They made no mention, no distinction in theirs. They just said all antler hunting, period.
Commissioner Hubbs?
Well, I'm just going back to the issue with harassment and not being able to monitor that. I guess, I mean, it doesn't make any difference if the animal is on private or public land if there is some sense of harassment. We'll talk about it later, but it goes to the whole trail cams, it goes to these things that provide some type of hardship if done too much on the wildlife, and our ability to regulate that on public and private land. So, I mean, that being said, are we saying that we don't feel comfortable regulating on private land, or that we have authority to regulate on private land if we feel it causes some type of harm to wildlife? I mean, because if that's the case, I would think that we have the obligation to regulate.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner Hubbs. It's an interesting legal argument or philosophical argument. If we're looking at it from a standpoint of harassing these animals, or maybe harassing isn't the right word, but displacing them, affecting how they feed in the winter and their energy reserves in the winter, then I think this board probably does have that authority to regulate that. If you're talking strictly about the object, the antler, and Deputy Attorney General Stockton may jump in here, but if you're talking specifically about the antler, once it's cast off the animal, if you're strictly looking at it from that standpoint, then this board probably doesn't have the authority to regulate that on private land. But you're right. I think, you know, if we're talking about displacing animals, moving animals, affecting how they survive the winter, then I think that probably does apply to private land.
So I know we mentioned that right now the evidence is somewhat anecdotal, like we don't have long-term studies where we're seeing that there's some type of impact, but we are hearing that there are negative impacts and various sightings in which we've seen this taking place. Have other states done any more formal studies or relying on different types of information at this point in time?
I'm not aware of specific studies that have looked at the impacts, and I don't know if Brian Wakeling or Tony, if you have, Director Wasley, if you have any thoughts on that or are aware of any, but you're right. You know, people have asked, well, show me the data that says shed hunters are having an impact, and I'm not sure that data is out there. I think it's a pretty logical assumption that if they're in deep snow and antler hunters are moving them off of their critical, bitter brush and sagebrush serviceberry feed, moving them up into the pinyon juniper or just causing them to deplete energy by running away into the next draw and then running away into the next draw. I think it's a pretty logical conclusion that there's an impact there. As far as hard scientific data of what that impact looks like, I don't know that would be visible on a population scale.
And just one last thing. I think it comes down to that word collect, because we were talking about, what if I'm driving down my private road and there's antlers there? Of course, you could move them. You just couldn't collect them, correct?
That's correct. And I know some of the cabs I'm hoping will come up and speak. I saw some of their input about wanting to change some of the language or add in some language about attempting to collect or something along those lines. To try to put a little bit of a stop on people who would go out and gather them up and stockpile them during that closed time or GPS them or whatever to then come back and get them once the season is open. So I think the cabs are going to come forward with some good input on that. The dates are worth debate here too. The date on the early end of January 1st, there's been a lot of discussion both 3 years ago and more recently at the cab level about that month of January. Because in January we still have some big game seasons going on, cow elk hunts, tons of upland bird hunting. I mentioned at the Washoe cab that I've spent many days chucker hunting when I came off the mountain with a couple antlers in my vest and no birds, because I can't miss an antler with a shotgun. So there was some discussion that maybe it doesn't need to start in January. Maybe it could be pushed back to February 1st as a start date to allow those hunts to finish up. But then there's also the issue that some deer do start dropping in January. The date on the back end of it has also been discussed at length. Rather than April, should it be April 15th? Should it be April 1st? Should it be April 30th? From a human perspective, a lot of people have talked about moving that a little bit earlier, maybe up to March 30th to allow for spring break people and all that sort of stuff. But one of our biologists who has management authority with sage grouse is really concerned about that month of April with sage grouse being on their strutting grounds, on their leks in April. So his thought was maybe it ought to be April 30th so that we don't all of a sudden release the hordes of shed hunters right when sage grouse are on the lek. So the dates are certainly up for debate. It could be a 60-day closure or 90-day or whatever you think those impacts look like.
Further commission questions? Director Wasley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to address Vice Chairman Johnston's question on the hours, and this is speculative as well, but since Chief Game Warden Turnipseed just brought up the issue of sage grouse, the Gunnison Basin has a distinct population segment of Gunnison sage grouse, and I'd speculate that 10 a.m. start time was to accommodate strutting activities. So I think that's just another strategy to consider when we start discussing some of those dates and trying to accommodate sage grouse. That's a listed population that's in Gunnison Basin.
Yeah, and of course the sage grouse are on those leks, from just before daylight to 9, 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, and then after that they disperse back to their nests and move off that lek.
Further questions or comments before I take it to public comment? Seeing none, we'll start with public comment in Las Vegas.
Yes, Chairman, we have comments in Las Vegas.
Hello, this is John Hyatt. I'm a Clark County cab member, but speaking for myself, I think I'd like to make 3 points. One, if people are going to benefit financially from commercial shed running, that they should be permitted and pay a fee for that, just like other people do for using Nevada's wildlife. Secondly, I think season is really important, especially in my perception on the late end. April 15th in White Pine, Elko, and even Lincoln County is still going to be very wet. And if most of this activity is taking place by motorized use of or motorized travel over the land, those guys are doing resource damage. And in sage grouse area, leks are one thing, but nesting is something else. And so they're disturbing sage grouse some way, either on the leks or in the nest. And that is not something that we should be allowing. The third point I would make is that in northern Nevada, we've got a lot of checkerboard land that's not noticed, it's not fenced. And so the private land issue becomes very difficult to enforce or police in that area. So I think that commercial shed hunting on private land needs to be regulated just as much as on public land as a means of protecting non-target species, if you will, or non-target animals. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hyatt.
Mr. Chair, Jana Wright for the record. I certainly support setting a season, and I don't see the need to have any exemption for private landowners. I think enforcement has discretion on who they would cite and not cite. So whatever the dates that the commission comes up with, but I certainly support having a season for collecting shed antlers. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana. Further public comment in Las Vegas?
No further comment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Public comment in Carson City. Come on up, Joe.
Joe Krim, Persian Cab. I'm going to apologize ahead of time because I did not get my minutes in, which Mr. Olmberg took me to task on that in the hallway. I was a little lax this week, but at our cab meeting, we definitely thought there needed to be a season. We didn't have any ideas on a date or anything like that, but we surely thought that with the problems that they have in Lincoln and Elko and White Pine, they need to have a season. We just didn't have any suggestions to go with from there. So as our cab, we supported a season on shed hunting.
Thank you, Mr. Krim.
Mr. Chairman, Rob Jacobson, Lyon County Cab. We had Mr. Chris Bragg from the Nevada Department help us and attended our meeting. We appreciated his help. This was quite a discussion. We feel a season is going to present some challenges. For example, people still going out and creating caches, going out, walking around, marking it with their GPS, and while they won't have any on them. So we're semi against the mandatory or the window as it is, but we do feel the Department of Wildlife, the biologists, game wardens should absolutely have the authority to close the season if the public's animals are stressed by the winter. And we trust that the Nevada Department of Wildlife on all of those matters, of course. If you do go to a season, I know this was brought up, December 31st, there are a lot of chucker hunters still out in the field. Mr. Bragg said that is a tough area, but he said by the letter of the law, you would not be allowed to pick those up, even though you were walking right by those. We feel that shed hunters should buy a permit, and they should have to take an online class, and that eliminates their ability to plead ignorance for driving their ATVs off the road. We feel that's the biggest issue, is the wild animals are used to vehicles driving up and down roads. They will walk around a bush, do whatever, and they're adapt to that. But we've all seen in the wild where those ATVs, trucks for that matter, are driving everywhere, and that we feel should be an automatic harassment of wildlife. I don't think you have to see an animal getting harassed to know that a vehicle off the road, getting back into the holes, doesn't bump the animals, it harasses them. And so we feel that that should be an automatic, either demerits or whatever you decided. But we feel the biggest issue is, and I'm not talking about people with disabilities, that's a different conversation. What we're talking about here are the masses. Anyone driving off-road is cited for harassment of wildlife. And that can be any time of the year. And then with that, we'd like to see the Bureau of Land Management work with the NDOW, and maybe they can share the information, sort of like a hotline, collect the information, and somehow work together so that we up the amount of officers in the field on that. With that, again, we're not for the set season per se, because we just think there's going to be ways around it. But we would like to see in those harder winters again, where NDOW has the right, like Utah did, to close the season. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobson.
For the record, Corey Laddle, Lincoln Cab. We support the regulation. Before I give you our additional language, I'd like to kind of maybe explain a couple things from my perspective. The reason we support just a straight season, the number one thing we're trying to do is reduce those impacts. And those impacts are going to vary somewhat between, higher elevations in Elko County and lower elevations in St. Lincoln County. And so, a good straight calendar date to us is a very simple, straightforward attempt at trying to reduce some of this impact. The other impacts to wildlife, things like that, are all going to coincide with just a straight elimination of the shed collection. It's easier from our perspective in law enforcement terms. It's straightforward language. And it's a clear message with the intent of the regulation. It's a clear message. You're not going to pick them up. You're not going to collect them. You're not going to do this. The education course, the online stuff that we had talked about before, this is, like everybody knows, this goes back a few years. The problem is when 19,000 people take that course, or 6,000 people in Nevada take that course, those guys are all out there. So as ethical as you can be, and as ethical as you can be, and as ethical as we all can be, if we're all out there together, we're doing the same damage, no matter how nice we're doing it. So just the sheer numbers of people that are doing this now is mind-boggling. It was brought to our attention a few years ago when we first started talking about this. A former biologist down in Lincoln, I won't say his name, but he's in the room. He says, you guys can't believe this, but if you really think about this, there are as many field days spent hunting sheds now as there are during normal hunting seasons. And if you quantify the amount of people that are out there, usually if you go on a deer hunt, say you hunt 5 days or you hunt 4 days, a lot of these shed hunters are taking weeks off, months, and it's day after day after day during these critical times, and there's no end to it. And so we can dance around all these other things all we want. A straight regulation is going to be the best solution in our opinion. What we wanted to do to the proposed regulation is just add in the language, and I've got copies of this if anybody wants to see it. As used in this section, collect means to gather, stockpile, or possess shed antlers, or attempt to gather, stockpile, or possess shed antlers. And it was mentioned before, there's always some discretion on the point of the law enforcement. The wardens know, they know who's doing it. If somebody's driving down their driveway and they move a horn because they don't want it to pop their tire, or if Tom has to take it out of his haystack, they know the difference. When there's a kid sitting on a winter range where there's been an established winter herd for months, and he's wearing binoculars and got a backpack on, and his 6 other buddies are sitting there in a camp, they pretty much know who's hunting sheds. And so that's what we wanted to recommend. We support it. In terms of dates, I'm speaking on behalf of myself now. We supported the regulation from January 1 to April 15th. I know we get into some issue with some late elk hunts, you know, some chucker hunts, things like that. January 15th to me is not a bad date. Even April 15th or April 30th is not a bad date. You know, we don't want to get somebody in trouble for picking up a shed antler from a previous season, you know, when they're out there hunting elk. So those dates are pretty flexible. Thanks.
Yeah, Commissioner McNitch, I think he has a question for you, Corey.
Corey, so out there in Lincoln County, what's the conversation on the private land aspect of it?
It's kind of what's discussed. We don't have some of those large checkerboard areas, but there are some isolated 40-acre pieces. I mean, my family owns some of those. They're not necessarily fenced. They're not necessarily legally posted. I don't think it's going to be a huge issue down there. I think the easy way, in my opinion, is to say on public lands and pull that private land thing out. You might add in what's, you know, kind of mirrors what the trail cam proposed regulation is, and I don't mean to jump into that, but with permission of the landowner, language of some sort. The private down there isn't as large an issue as it would be, say, in Elko or White Pine County. So maybe these guys can speak on that.
Thank you, Corey.
Shane Bourne, White Pine County Cab. Our meeting, first of all, on the online course, we did not agree with an online course because our thoughts were that the animal that you're pushing to get his antler did not care if you took the course or not. He just cared that he was being pushed in a critical time of year. That was all he cared about. Same thing with the license. We did not choose to get into the commercialization of horn hunting. We didn't feel that was a part of this. We were more worried about the animal itself during that time of year. 5 years ago when this was brought up the first time, our meeting was packed, and it was, I believe it was a 3-2 vote, but we had members of our committee that were very opposed to horn hunting season. Today, one of them members is still on our committee, and he's absolutely in support of it. The public at that meeting was about a 50-50 split, and the room was full. Today, if you went around White Pine County, and Mr. Marks will attest to this, he works at Sports World, that I would just to throw out a figure, probably 90% of the people out there are in favor of a horn hunting season. Personally, I haven't talked to anybody that's opposed to a season. As far as we were, on October 19th, we met, 2 of our members of our cab met with Lincoln County's cab in Ely, and we are in complete agreement with them on the season dates and everything in the languages as it's proposed with the changes that we made. A little bit of history on a personal note. A little bit over 25 years ago, I was a government trapper, and I spent 5 days a week in Area 22 and 13. From January 1st until fishing started, I saw 2, maybe 3 bobcat trappers. And I covered Dry Lake, Coal Valley, Garden Valley. Today, if you go down the 15th of January and it's open, meaning no snow cover, you can go to Coyote Springs and see a camp of probably 7 RVs that are specifically there to hunt horns. You go to Coal Valley, you'll see the same thing. As long as there's no snow on the ground or not enough snow to inhibit horn hunting, they will be there in the critical time of the year for mule deer and elk. Thank you.
Thank you. Further public comment in Carson City? Dr. Dixon.
For the record, Paul Dixon, clerk. There was considerable debate at our cab about shed antler collecting, and I think in large part it comes from the fact that there's a little bit of confusion over what's meant by commercial versus personal collecting. We don't have an outfit, as far as I know, that comes in and says, okay, you 25 guys go hunt sheds. There's 25 guys that come in that are friends or know each other, come in and they collect, they take stuff back, and they find a commercial buyer. And so how you distinguish somebody who's collecting 4 sheds to put on his porch or put in his house on his mantle or decorate with versus a guy that's going to take 4 sheds and go sell them to the commercial collector sitting in town site is a difficult thing. And for that reason, we had a hard time trying to distinguish between personal collecting and what ultimately becomes commercial collecting. And what you do, so our cab was very much in line with both White Pine and Lincoln in that there should be a season. The season date should be set where it has the least impact on lekking, it has least impact on chucker hunters, but it's also a time of the year where you want to keep people out of the field for both habitat reasons and wintering wildlife. And that seems to be where Corey talked about sometime early to mid-January and sometime, even though you can overlap a little bit with chucker, and sometime, you know, in April, mid to late April, you're going to be ending, which tends to be critical times in our stuff. And I've complained to this commission, I shouldn't say complain, I brought to this commission's attention for a long time. In fact, Chad Bliss supported this concept that we hunt cow elk into January. And I've been against that for the same reasons for the last 4 years, the fact that we hunt cow elk into January. I think cow elk hunting should end on New Year's weekend, and we should not have any hunting other than maybe chucker hunting because that's a light footprint on the landscape. And to be honest with you, I see shed antler collecting in January in that time frame as having the same or greater impact than we do when we do hunting out there. And I think just the sheer numbers of people that take this online course in Utah and the fact that there's no season here are, I say not all of them, but a large majority of them are going to come over here and hunt sheds in Nevada because they can. And so that impact is real. And it's not anecdotal. I mean, there are lots of people that come over, and there's money to be made. I mean, antlers, as far as I know, at one point were selling back 20 years ago for $4 or $5 a pound now for brown antler. Now they're upward $15 to $20 a pound. I mean, if you think about that, a set of elk brown antlers brings in real money for the time and effort put in the field. It's more profitable than trapping. That's why people are spending the days in the field. The biggest problem I have is how do you, when you set a season, if somebody's out there and they pick up a shed, it really does come down to law enforcement discretion of whether they're out collecting for personal or doing something. And I've had both good and bad experiences with law enforcement where people try to do the right thing and they've been and I've heard of law enforcement very forgiving. So you can't always count on law enforcement discretion there. So I think you have to put a hard line in the sand that says X or Y. And if it causes this bill to fail at the legislature, then so be it. But I don't think you can be wishy-washy here. I think it has to be you say either you allow it or you don't allow it. And you know, if you're out there and you pick it up at your own risk. If you carry one that the game warden is either going to be understanding or not understanding, if you're with your grandson type thing. So, and I'll end with that public versus private. I'll come back to that is at this point in time where you're checkerboarded, I don't think you can have any distinction between public and private. So if you're going to make a statewide regulation, you either make it by county, which seems like a lot of work, or you just make a statewide regulation that addresses the checkerboard area where public and private are really hard to distinguish, especially when you get up in Elko and that north, 06 and 07 areas. It's really checkerboarded. Thanks.
Commissioner Young.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on this law enforcement lack of discretion? Who are you talking about? Tyler's folks or Metro?
I'm talking about Tyler's folks and the way that...
specific example, Paul.
You want me to put me on the record?
Yeah.
There was a law enforcement issue with a person who was turkey hunting that self-identified and went through a lot of hassle versus I know 2 people who harvested multiple animals and did not have the same punishments because of law enforcement discretion. Big game animals versus a turkey. Turkey shot by accident, clearly by accident, led to a 9-point violation. And I know big game animals that were shot and there was not that sort of penalty. So law enforcement discretion really does come down to law enforcement discretion and what they feel. And to be honest with you, it can be a good thing. And it can also be something by the letter of the law, all 3 of them should have gotten what the turkey hunter got, but the turkey hunter got the hardest punishment. The point being is that discretion is discretion and it's not evenly handed out there. So to make Tyler's people have to bear that burden, I don't think is a fair burden to put on them. Thank you.
Fair enough. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Come on up, Rex.
Rex Flowers speaking for Nevada Coalition for Wildlife. We looked at this, and the only comment we have at this time is we'd like to see this done on a unit basis. This is a problem in eastern Nevada, not western Nevada. So we'd like to see it stay with those areas that need the enforcement. I know you'll hear from some who'll tell you that, well, if you close Unit A, people are going to float into Unit B. That's true to a point. A commercial collector who's in business to make money is not going to come to Northern Washoe or to 041 in Pershing to go broke. He's in business to make money. So we think it should be done on a regional basis. We have no other comment at this time until wording comes out of the workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Rex. Further public comment? Ms. Bozier?
Karen Boger, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, Nevada chapter, Mr. Chairman and commission members. We put out a comment paper to you in which we threw at you a whole bunch of questions, concerns, etc. And many of those have been brought up this morning and greatly appreciative of this discussion and how broad-ranging it is, because I think one of the most important things to zero in on is what is the purpose, and is this really going to address that? But I can say with certainty that to a person, our board is supportive of a season. What we wanted to hear were some of the concerns related to, what are the dates, what are the other attendant potential problems such as public versus private land. So it's been very productive from our standpoint this morning. And I want to tell you that it's also been very productive from our national BHA standpoint too, because I've been putting out word both to national and to most of our Western state chapters regarding this issue, because we haven't really had much of a discussion on it to date. We deal more with fair chase issues, in which this is arguably not that. So, so they will benefit as well from this, because we're very much engaged in that right now. But taking my hat off, I'm also pleased to see that some issues have been brought up, for instance, from the Lyon County gentleman about off-road vehicle impacts of going off-route, particularly during that vulnerable time of the year. And that is indeed also arguably it's a federal responsibility to enforce that, particularly in the areas where routes have already been designated, so it is illegal to go off route. But there is a piece for NDOW as well, because of the harassment of wildlife. So I would really like to see that being pursued further, not necessarily through this regulation, but for us to continue to think about, and maybe MOUs between the feds and NDOW, such as they have in other states. And lastly, as the gentleman from White Pine County brought up, I think that there is a little bit of a divide between, is this about the animal and protection of the animal, or is it related to massive industrial collection? And I think that it would be great to continue that discussion after this regulation is settled, one way or the other, is what exactly are our responsibilities in terms of the commons, what belongs to all of us, wildlife and our public lands, because honestly, if you walked into my cabin, you would see that my late husband and I, have used antlers for all sorts of decorative purposes, but those were from harvested animals. We had a permit to take those animals, and we paid for that. Plus, there is a limit on those takings. So I hope that in future we will consider such things as permit, limit, that sort of thing regarding this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. Further public comment?
Grant, one more, just come back a quick statement.
Sure.
For the record, Paul Dixon, one last thing I forgot to mention is that BLM currently regulates mineral collection in the state. So if you get a permit to go collect minerals from somewhere, they do it on a poundage basis. In other words, you're allowed to collect so many pounds a day, or have in your possession or stockpile or whatever, so many pounds of things. And it's something to think about if we're going to look at commercial versus hobbyist collection. Most hobbyists are going to have less than so many pounds of antler they're going to be carrying around in general. And that may be one way to look at this is follow a federal statute that we have that looks at poundage. It's just a thought. I forgot to mention that. Thank you for the...
Thanks, Paul. Further public comment? Seeing no more public comment in Carson City, I'll bring it back to the commission. Commissioner Hubbs?
Just when we were talking about the mineral component, this may sound really silly, but I don't know much about shed antlers or collecting them in general, but I mean, how long do shed antlers stay on the ground? What do they contribute to the environment? If they do have some type of mineral component, do they biodegrade? Is it harmful to remove them in mass quantities? I'm not 100% sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner Hubbs. Chief Game Warden Tyler Turnipseed for the record. I would have to admit that I'd be speaking a little bit out of my realm of expertise, but certainly there is a mineral component there. Historically, these antlers would break down. They sort of, lose their hard shell and turn chalky from the sun, I think from UV degradation, and then rodents start chewing on them, and eventually, over the span of 10 years in wet country or 40 years in dry country, they eventually return back into the ground and then presumably are taken back up again by plants and browse that then are eaten again by deer or elk. Beyond that, I'm not sure I am qualified to answer that question, but yeah, historically they all returned back into the soil.
So there's no other wildlife that depend on it in any way? They're not used in any type of resource, or for any type of resource for wildlife in general? I mean, we can speculate for plants. But you were, in that presentation, you stated that they do, the resin, that they're actually ground down sometimes, or is that how they're weighed, or how are they monitored?
Yes, it's my understanding that, the biggest, nicest, freshest antlers go into, artwork, chandeliers, tables, that kind of thing. They're sold as whole antlers. The smaller ones or the more degraded ones get ground up, and those antlers are used in everything from mineral blocks, in the cattle industry, I think, to medicinal or ginseng type purposes overseas, those kind of things. But yeah, so there's sort of a different market there for the really good stuff versus the lesser antlers. When you sell them, though, when you sell them to the antler buyer, they'll grade them out, A, B, C, and D, depending on how white and chalky they are versus the fresh browns. And then they'll say, okay, well, I'm going to give you $1 a pound for this pile, $5 a pound for this pile, $14 a pound for that pile, based on how fresh they are, and then weigh each one of those piles and pay you by the pound.
Director Wasley.
I just wanted to add to Commissioner Hubb's question relative to the role of antlers in the ecosystem. So they are a significant source of minerals for small mammals. Everything from porcupines to mice, shrews, voles nibble on them and contribute to nutrient cycling. Chief Game Warden Turnipseed's correct in those drier climes where you have really low density distribution of small mammals. They're persistent, decades. You can find old chalky antlers with lichens, appearing on them, growing on them. But in those wetter areas, in areas in riparian corridors, Yellowstone National Park, for example, it's illegal to take antlers from that environment, but yet they don't amass, probably due to some illegal take, but also through that nutrient cycling and the role of small mammals in consumption. And oftentimes when you find a shed antler in a riparian area or a wetter area, if you pick it up, you'll see little grooves and incisions where those small mammals have gnawed on it. So they certainly facilitate that nutrient cycling. I don't know if it's a significant source of nutrients in the ecosystem, but they do have a role in providing minerals to small mammals.
Thank you, Director.
I was just going to state, I mean, already we know in such an arid state, any form of nutrients that we can get back into the soil is really important for most of our habitats. So I just was concerned that if there is this large commercial take of it, it could be potentially harmful to long term.
Further commission questions? Commissioner Omberg?
Just a comment, I don't think that all of the collection is, by commercialization. I think if those horns stay on the ground long enough, they eventually get picked up by someone that passes by, and which is, again, part of the problem with regulating this is there's a lot of people, and in fact, non-consumers, the whole gamut of people, when they pass them, they usually pick them up and pack them off. So, if you try to separate commercialization from personal, I don't think in the long run there's going to be much of a difference of effect. I think the horns are still going to get picked up.
Further commission comments or questions? Commissioner Johnston?
I guess I have a couple of comments. I understand, a lot of the comments about we should not make an exemption for private property, but I think that decision has kind of been made for us already because the statute was enacted, the regulation went up to the Legislative Commission, and unless there's some consideration given to private land, then the regulation's not going to take effect. That's just a political reality that we face. So I think you have to deal with that. And I'm pretty convinced that if you close public lands during this period of time or any window period of time, it's going to effectively end the collection during that window of time just because of the vastness of the amount of public land. So my comment would be to, one, if you look at the draft language, is to focus on public lands, to make the prohibition specific to public lands rather than trying to create a carve-out for private. I also think it's a regional problem. And I wrote down here, I really think that if we're going to do this, maybe it would cover Elko, Eureka, Lander, Lincoln, Nye, and White Pine counties. I think that would cover the problem areas and prevent just a movement from, let's say, Lincoln or White Pine, Elko counties into other parts in central Nevada. I don't think it's a real issue in other parts of the state. I just don't think the numbers are there that you'd have a massive influx of people trying to collect shed antlers. I do like the Colorado suggestion of limitations of hours. I don't know what the other appetite of the commission is for that. And I think the other thing is the fact that some hunting seasons may go into January. I think that's just a very different activity that doesn't put the stress that the collection, mass collection of shed antlers does. It's just a different type of behavior. So if I looked at this, this is kind of how I came up with the language. Was I don't like the term collect. I like the term take or gather. It's a little more clear. So when I went through the proposed language, it would read something along the lines of a person shall not take or gather shed antlers from or on public lands in Elko, Eureka, Lander, Lincoln, Nye, and White Pine counties at any time during a year unless the shed antlers are taken or gathered from or in the field from May 1st to December 31st, inclusive of that year.
Commissioner Young?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hey, Tyler, what's your opinion on, are most of the shed antler hunters out-of-state folks? And is it conceivable that the eastern part of the state's more affected? Because I know a personal experience, a lot of Utah people come over and poach ours. They come in droves, actually.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner Young. Of course, it would be purely speculative. I think, if you're talking about shed hunters in central Nevada, the northern part, I would say probably more Nevadans. But yeah, on that Lincoln, White Pine, and Elko, especially this past year with Utah's closure, I would say the vast majority were Utah people. Without Utah's closure, I don't know, maybe Commissioner Allenberg or Mr. Lytle might have another guess at that, but I think the majority would still be out-of-state hunters for a lot of that time frame.
Is your opinion, do they contribute anything to the state or financially or biologically or anything else?
I think you could assume that they contribute a little bit to local economies with gas and food, but as far as wildlife dollars, my assumption is that most Nevada shed hunters probably hunt, so they also have a license, whereas out-of-state shed hunters, some of them may apply for Nevada tags, but I would guess that the majority just come over for antler season and don't contribute anything financially.
Commissioner Hubbs?
I didn't think about the geographic area exclusion, but I found it, every county was from what I've written down, unless I missed something, was for setting a season. So it's like, I felt like there was some kind of consistent consensus across the state that a season might be best. Because what I'm also hearing too is that, I'm keen and more on the harassment personally of the wildlife, but I am hearing that potentially this may be impacting hunting. Based on some of the literature I read outside of this, was that it's also a time to kind of go out and recreate, obtain shed antlers, and then scope, before or after the season or whatever. And I don't know if that's a problem. That didn't really come up today when we were talking, but I don't know if there's also this sense that it impacts the hunt, if you will, later recreationally. So I don't know if I would want to narrow it, because for me, I think going back to the purpose would be to protect wildlife during vulnerable periods of time, and that should apply statewide. That's just what I'm hearing.
I guess my response to that is I don't think it's a problem in the other counties, in the sense of if someone was to come to where I live in Lyon County and engage in shed antler hunting in January, go for it. You're going to put a lot of miles on your vehicle and probably not find anything. We don't have the elk. We don't have the deer numbers. I think as I interpreted the CAB's support for this, it's really focused on the problem that's being seen on the eastern side of the state. And that's really where the issue and the pressure on the animals occurs. It's not at the other parts of the state.
Commissioner Hubbs.
Oh, and then we also mentioned, though, just really quickly, all of those counties that you mentioned, Elko, Lincoln, and White Pine, are those the only counties with sage-grouse populations, or do we have any other concerns outside of those counties for sage-grouse issues?
I guess my rationale for that is certainly there are sage-grouse populations in the counties that I did not include in this, but my perception is that shed antler hunting is not a problem in those counties that would then have a negative impact on those sage-grouse populations. For example, in South Lyon County, we have the bi-state population. It's a critical population for sage-grouse there on the California-Nevada border. I've heard nothing about a problem where people are hunting shed antlers in that area that would have a detrimental impact on the sage grouse population. I think the same would be said for other parts of the state as well.
Commissioner Barnes.
Yeah, first I want to say I agree with the wording that Commissioner Johnston put in his recommendation. That's exactly how I would have worded it. In regards to the private land, I want everyone here to understand that we actually had this discussion at a cattlemen's meeting last spring, and Director Wasley was there, and it's a big concern to a lot of private landowners with what's going on, not only to the animals, but to the resource, the ground itself. And that's where a lot of this came from recently, was because a lot of the ground that was getting dug up early in the spring. And so I think you're not going to have to worry about a lot of private landowners granting access to people coming to collect shed horn antlers, because they're, we are genuinely concerned about the wildlife as well as the ground. So I think that's going to be a real issue. I mean, it's going to happen because it is, but generally I don't think we need to be concerned with a lot of horn hunting going on private land per se. Then that kind of leads into the date question. We do have the state is very diverse, and in northern Elko County, the middle of April sometimes the ground is still wet, and we haven't had a lot of green up. And so those animals haven't had a chance to get a lot of that early tender feed, that's got the protein and stuff in it that they need. And so I think we need to push that back, at least to the 1st of May. That way it gives the animals time to have 2 weeks of good forage before everybody hits the ground. And then a lot of time, by the time you get there, those animals are dispersed. They're not in the big groups like they were when they went through the winter. So they're scattered more. And then the ground has had a chance to dry out. But, on the western side of the state, like when you get around Humboldt County, their spring starts a month before we do in eastern Nevada. So I think by breaking it up, I think you're taking care of a lot of that. Where Humboldt County doesn't have the same issues that like Elko and White Pine do.
I got something real quick. Part of what Commissioner Hubbs has brought up with the rest of the state, I agree with you, and I don't think there's an issue in a lot of the other parts of the state, but I do think that when it comes to it, it's not like we come back and we revisit this and we can set a season. So if something develops down the road in one of these other counties that neighbors, the ones we're talking about, we're gonna have to go through the entire process again in order to get there and to protect that one area. And I don't know that I have as much heartburn with having it as a statewide situation versus narrowing it down to counties. And I mean, it's not gonna ruin my support one way or the other, but I just wanted to put that out there, as I feel like the rest of the state probably deserves the same protection as those other counties, even though there may not be an existing problem today. So just for the rest of the commission to think about, that's one of the concerns I have about it. Commissioner Hubbs.
Yes, I agree too, because of some of the issues with where are these folks coming from? Are they actually from that county? I can't remember the data that we were looking at, but I think roughly 30% of them, let's just say more or less, are from that county. Some are from out of state, 27, and then another 30 from someplace else in the state. So I think if you're leaving loopholes, they're going to maybe just shift, and what they'll find is now they can't do it here, so they're doing it over in this county.
Right, and I'm the same way as Commissioner Johnston. In my county, in my lifetime, I don't think I've found 5 sheds. But that doesn't mean that the wildlife don't deserve the same protection during that critical time as the rest of the state. I guess that's my opinion on it. Commissioner Johnston.
I guess my response to that is that I'm not saying the animals in other counties don't deserve the same protection. What I'm saying is they don't need the protection right now. And therefore what I'm saying is that people who are out in the field, let's say chucker hunting in northern Washoe County in January and they come across a shed, should be a prohibition from them picking up in that instance, because the animals are certainly worthy of the same protection statewide. There's just a difference in what the animals need in different parts of the state, and that's why I've made that distinction in my proposed language. And one of the things I wanted to say is, one thing I'm really comfortable about this is it's not a prohibition on collecting sheds. Everybody can still do it. It's just they can't do it in a certain time of the year, so no one is shutting anybody out from this passion, hobby, recreational activity, whatever it may be for them. They are still allowed to do it. We've just found a balance in which they don't do it. The only other thing I had for consideration was whether or not to follow something like Colorado did on time limit and hours. And I really thought that was kind of a neat idea. And I suspect it has to do with giving the animals a break when the shed antler is occurring. My only hesitation to that is I would really like to be able to hear from the public at a later meeting on that idea, because I don't think it's a concept that was really before the public prior to this meeting, was if you were to limit or put hours on it, 9 or 10 a.m. to sunset, how would the public react to that? I certainly don't think that really inhibits anybody from the activity, other than, take a little less stress off the animals when the shed antler hunting starts come May 1st. Everyone's not out there at 5 a.m. and going gangbusters while animals are up feeding and doing things like that. So that would be something I'd certainly consider, but I'd like to hear more from the public about that. But I guess my question is, if we do that, do we put that into a revised markup then for another workshop?
I'm not exactly sure the timeline on that. I think at this point, we're really, by the time we get to it, we're going to miss this season anyway, correct? Most of it?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Tyler Turnipseed for the record again. I think after this meeting, if you didn't bring it back for a second workshop, then presumably it would be up for an action item in January, that being the next meeting. So if you passed it in January, it would then be enacted, or the earliest that could then be enacted is at the next meeting of the State Legislative Commission. Of course, it would be speculative when that would be, but sometime after January, February, March. So it would be a little bit difficult to implement midstream. I think we could do that if we were having a harsh winter. We could jump in and say, put out the press releases and everything and say, okay, the Legislative Commission just passed this, so it's effective today. And maybe if the winter wasn't as harsh, we could wait and roll it out next year. But yeah, it would be dependent on the Legislative Commission passing it at their next meeting after your January meeting, if you put it up for action in January. If you brought it back for another workshop in January, then the next meeting after January, I think, is March, or is there a February meeting? I think it's March after the January meeting, so then it would be implemented, sometime April or May.
Does that answer your question?
Kind of.
I mean, I guess from my perspective, your proposal today has been discussed. I mean, it kind of came from the cabs and the public in the roundabout way there. So I don't know that there would be a problem so much as to bring it back.
And I think for the hours perspective, I don't see that as a huge earth-shattering change, and you could take public comment on it at the January meeting, both at the cab level and at the commission level. And it might be kind of a hybrid thing where February and March, you say no shed collecting, but then April you allow for those sage grouse leks and that sort of stuff by starting later in the day. You could have a hybrid of the two.
And I guess you brought up another thing during your discussion there, that we're not closing it. It's still going to be, people can still do it. And I guess from that perspective, I look at it as across the entire state, if we did something that covered the entire state instead of singling out counties, we're still not closing it. So
Well, I think what I would do is put the time limit statewide and put the closure from, or the season of May 1 to December 31 limit by counties. I mean, that's just where I'm personally at.
Okay.
So, I mean, what I would, and I can read this again to see if people, to make sure it's clear, but what I had proposed was that the regulation would read, a person shall not take or gather shed antlers from or on public lands in Elko, Eureka, Lander, Lincoln, Nye, and White Pine counties at any time during a year unless the shed antlers are taken or gathered from or in the field from May 1st to December 31st inclusive of that year. A person shall only take or collect shed antlers.
Take or gather.
Yeah, I think my problem now is I had the language written to be limited by the counties, but hold on just a second.
Well, in my opinion, if we're going to do it by county, I think you go ahead and do your time limit by the county as well and leave the rest alone.
Then I would say, then a person shall only take or collect shed antlers from or on public lands in Elko, Eureka, Lander, Lincoln, Nye, and White Pine counties from May 1st to December 31st inclusive between the hours of 10 a.m. and sunset.
Commissioner Allenberg.
Yes, actually, Grant, you had a very, you hit the nail on the head, in my opinion, about looking forward to these other areas. The popularity, the explosion of popularity, in my opinion, happened right at the same time as the success and the quality of the elk herds in our area. And the commercial value, it takes a lot of deer horns to get picked up to equal one set of elk sheds. We know later on in discussions when we're talking about pioneering elk herds, we have Winnemucca in the Humboldt County area now. Once that herd gets bigger, the impact is going to increase from what it is today, almost certainly. I was a little bit interested and was hoping that we could hear a little bit more on the effects of what's going on in Monitor Valley with that elk herd. Is it similar to conditions and as far as pressure on the animals as it is in the eastern part of the state?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Allenberg, Chief Game Warden Turnipseed for the record, and this is maybe a little more of a game division question, so I don't know if anybody wants to jump in on that, but my impression is that the elk herd in Monitor Valley is doing really well. I can speak personally to that, but they seem to disperse more when they go to winter than some of the other herds. I think some of those bulls move off of Table Mountain and go 40 or 50 miles south, and some of them probably go 30 miles north and don't have quite as concentrated. So I guess I would sort of rate, if you're going to go by county, it's almost 3 tiers of counties, with Elko, White Pine, and Lincoln being the top tier of pressure. And then second tier with a little bit of pressure would be Nye, Lander, Eureka. And then when you get west of those counties, I won't say no pressure, but very, very minimal pressure. You're right, Humboldt County now has a growing elk herd, so there's probably going to be some impacts in the future there. But, you know, like some of the prior speakers said, Pershing, Lyon, Story, Douglas, shed hunting is, I won't say it's not a thing, but Sierra Front, of course, has some shed hunting pressure, but it's already pretty well urbanized, and those deer see people every day. So yeah, Mineral, Esmeralda, virtually no shed hunting pressure. Does that answer your question, or did I?
Yes.
I don't know so much about the Monitor Valley impacts. I don't know of very many people hunting sheds there, but then again, I've never patrolled it.
Yeah, thanks.
But I guess in being forward thinking on this, I kind of see, just in that discussion, seeing the creep from east to the west. I mean, I agree, chances are Esmeralda, Mineral, those areas, maybe not, but at the same time, I have Mineral County that wants elk. So someday, I think we're going to be there. When I can indulge Glenn.
I see Cody McKee coming up, one of our big game specialists. He may have something to add here.
Turn it on.
I think you're on.
Am I on? Chairman Wallace, Cody McKee, for the record. I don't know if I'm going to be able to provide a whole lot more clarity to Commissioner Allenberg's question about Monitor Valley in particular. But I can say from some of the reports that we received from our biologists on aerial surveys this last spring, that almost across the state we were seeing more disturbance on the landscape. We were seeing fences cut. From my recollection, we had one of our biologists believe that there was someone in a helicopter chasing game around, trying to get them to drop their antlers. I'd have to go back in my notes and double check that, but essentially what we're seeing is shed hunting is becoming more popular. People are putting more pressure on our herds, and regardless of where it's at, that pressure affects the populations. People in the field. The Sierra Front has become really popular for shed hunting. The Humboldt Range, where we have our expanding elk herds, it's going to become more of an issue, especially if that's left out of any closures. So if you start looking at the areas where shed hunting isn't having an impact, it's only a few counties now. So from that perspective, I don't know if I was able to help, but was hoping that I could provide a little bit more clarity from what we're seeing.
Thank you, Cody. I think you did help. You make me feel more strongly about the entire state instead of just separating some counties out. Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think about the primary place. I had a lot of concerns with the sage grouse this season. I think a lot of Commissioner Johnson's proposals alleviated a lot of my concerns, minus the one about the statewide versus regional. I understand the concept. So, you know, I would certainly lean to more of a statewide thing, but I think that Commissioner Johnson's proposal certainly seems like something that we could roll forward with to the next commission meeting and get some public input on and see where we fall out on all the issues. I think that's just literally the only one that I might have a different of opinion on, but I think the others I'm getting more comfortable with as we talk. So that's just where I stand on it.
Vice Chairman Johnston.
I guess too that if we rolled this forward to the next meeting for an action item, Humboldt County themselves can tell us whether or not they want to be included, since they're the ones with the, what I would say, the emerging elk population and the potential issue. They know it. I don't think the numbers are there where you're going to get that type of pressure, but we can hear from them, and we can certainly hear from every other county as to the proposal we set forth, as to where they're at and whether or not they don't want to be exempted from it because they think that might present a problem for them. We can hear from them and go from there. You know, I'm not going to fall on my sword on this issue by certain counties being covered and others not. If the public's all for, it's going to hold up the regulation that's needed. Because I certainly think something is needed, especially in the eastern part of the state.
Your mic's still not on, Commissioner Olber.
Push the little guy.
There you go.
Yes, I don't have any issue, and everything about the areas that aren't getting impacted right now, I have no issue with. You know, in fact, I completely agree with you that there should be no restrictions because there's no making. Even if there's only one shed, if someone walks by it, they'll probably get picked up. So, you know, eliminating all those issues from areas that aren't being impacted, I have no issue with it at all, none.
And I agree with that as well, but I just wanted to bring that forth so we could have a discussion on it. And maybe question for you, Chief Turnipseed, if we bring it back with we're limiting by county, and at that meeting we decide to go make a broader stroke, is that going to be detrimental to a substantial change, or are we better to go with the broader stroke and then narrow it down? I guess either way it's probably a substantial change regardless.
Yeah, we're kind of at the mercy of of the Legislative Council Bureau, but my general feeling is that just tinkering with the dates and locations isn't a huge meaningful change as far as language or the legal implications of it. My general feeling is that those would be accepted as not substantive changes, but I could be wrong there. And as a note too, looks like Mike Scott, one of our big game biologists, is up here who's seen a lot of this issue firsthand. I don't know if he's got anything to add.
Chairman Wallace, for the record, Mike Scott. Some of the questions about the counties that are involved in this, the Nevada Department of Wildlife is receiving public records requests for our deer survey data and our elk survey data. There are people that are requesting that information so they can specifically go out to the places that we've surveyed and look for sheds in those areas where we have classified bucks or bulls. And as far as the counties that this is going, what you'll see is that people that aren't able to go to one county will search out that data and go to the next county where it's available. It's recreation for a certain number of individuals, and your county may not see that impact right now, but it will.
Commissioner Hubbs. Thank you.
Yes, the one thing I didn't, after listening to Vice Chair Johnston's kind of his draft, I was thinking about the whole, I think it was the Lincoln County CAB, also there was a concern, not about taking or gathering, but going out and kind of, flagging locales or locations, and should we think about the attempt to do that, or is that too much? Are we regulating too much at some point? But I mean, I don't know about that component about just going out and kind of strategizing. I mean, because that leads me to the thought of the whole going out and being out in the field to strategize the hunt and then taking a couple sheds while you're there. It's the same kind of concept of going out and scouting that area. So right on that day that you can get out there, boom, you know where they're at.
Chief Turnipseed, any comments on enforcement of that?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Wallace and Commissioner Hubbs. I did ask Utah's Chief Game Warden about the problem of people going out and the enforceability of being able to curtail that activity of going out and GPSing sheds or stockpiling and being able to make that burden of proof that they were antler hunting. He said that certainly is an issue. His feeling was that their closure curtailed 80 or 90% of the activity, and said, there certainly was still a small percentage of people who they would contact in the field with a backpack, binoculars, who they felt were shed hunting, but they weren't cited because they didn't have sheds in possession. He said certainly there was still some of that going on, but he thought it curtailed the vast majority of the activity.
Further commission comments or questions? Seeing none, I guess we'll move forward with Vice Chairman Johnston's draft for, what's that, January meeting?
That sounds good, and I think I got the notes pretty closely, but if not, I can check back on the recording, and I think I captured that for January.
Just call me.
And I guess I should
hand it to you.
Yeah, I got the first part, the take or gather and the counties, but I wasn't real clear on the hours part.
Oh. One further comment from Commissioner Barnes.
Do we need to make this in the form of a motion? To be clear?
No, it's a workshop. So we'll go with this draft. The next time we'll put it up for action. Further questions? Seeing none, we'll take let's take a break until 11:40. All right, Chief Turnipseed's back. We'll We'll resume the meeting with agenda item number 7. Commission General Regulation 440, Trail Cameras and Other Devices, LCB file number R012-16, Chief Game Warden Tyler Turnipseed, workshop public comment allowed. The commission will hold a workshop to consider regulation relating to amending Chapter 503 of the Nevada Administrative Code. The proposed regulation change is intended to restrict the use of motion and heat sensing cameras that are left for a period of time and not held in the hand. The proposed language would prohibit, with certain exemptions, the use of trail cameras within 200 feet of a spring, water hole, or artificial basin from August 1st to December 31st of each year. The proposed language would further prohibit the use of transmitting trail cameras at any location from August 1st to December 31st of each year. The commission held a workshop on March 25th, 2016, and directed the department to revise previously drafted language prohibiting the use of trail cameras only for the purposes of scouting or hunting. Chief Turnipseed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief Game Warden Tyler Turnipseed again. And many of you will remember that this is also an issue that we've been talking about for at least a decade that I know of. Looking back through my predecessor's files, he had several presentations on trail cameras. I know that since I've been chief since 2014, we've spoken about it quite a bit. As you said, our last workshop, I believe, was in 2016, during which you guys gave direction to change the wording of it a little bit. So I can go through that wording, but first I've got a little PowerPoint, sort of like Sheds, to where we can go through some of the background on the issue and how we've gotten to where we are now. So it's similar in a lot of ways to the issue we just discussed with trail cameras, and it's similar for a couple reasons. One being that probably Lincoln, White Pine, and Elko counties are the epicenter of where these have become a problem. And it's similar in that people on both sides of this issue are pretty passionate, and you know, we're in that position of being in the middle to try to hear the wishes of both sides. One side has been asking us for several years, when are you going to do something about these trail cameras? They're out of control. The other side saying they're really not hurting anything. They're a good tool. We use them. There's no issue. And I think it's similar to shed hunting. It started off as something pretty innocent. You know, 10 or 20 years ago, a person goes out, buys a couple trail cameras, they take their kids out on weekends, check the camera, see what's on it, get really excited about the wildlife that's on the camera. You know, you might get a chance to see a bobcat or a mountain lion or something unusual. But then fast forward 10 or 20 years and several orders of magnitude, and now we're in the position where I'll show some pictures of water holes with 20, 30, 40 cameras on them. Individuals and or guides who use literally hundreds of cameras. We heard an anecdotal or somewhat of a hearsay rumor story this year from a hunt in eastern Nevada. Two people were sort of competing for the same buck, probably a buck that you guys have seen, and the one person tells the other, hey, I've got 297 cameras out. I've got pictures of every deer in this part of the state. If you guys will get out of here and leave me alone on this buck, I'll give you another buck. So again, purely hearsay, but a very believable hearsay. So this PowerPoint here, we'll go through some of the photos and some of the issues, if we can pull that up. There we go. So most of these pictures are fairly fresh. This one is just from earlier this summer. It's the Acoma guzzler. You'd have to correct me from Lincoln County, but I believe it's in Area 24, but it is in Lincoln County. And you can see about 19 cameras in this photo if you zoom it in closely, but I'm told there were 32 cameras on it this summer. So again, it seems like an order of magnitude that has grown a lot. This one's even just recent. This one's in Barnes Canyon in 231. There were 17 cameras on it last week. So, you know, clearly it's a summertime problem when animals are hitting the water hard every day, but even now this late in the year, still that many cameras out on this guzzler. Again, some more water tanks. There's, of course, 4 or 5 in this picture. Here's 7 in one tree. I'm not sure where this one was taken, but literally 7 cameras on one water hole. Here's another 5 cameras on one spot. So we started noticing some of these type of posts on social media. This one's from an outfitter posting a photo that says, here we go again, we're getting excited to get out and run these stealth cams. There's 90 cameras, brand new cameras in a box in that photo. So again, it seems like an order of magnitude that's gone beyond a parent and a child going out on the weekend to check 3 cameras. This is from a local, not local, but a Nevada outfitter is posting this one. Says this is our first batch. There's 64 cameras in this batch that say they're ready to go out and start scouting. This has progressed in the last year or two to websites and phone apps that deal in this kind of stuff. This one, you can see that geotagged image data slide in which you can subscribe to this service and be able to pull up trail camera images from a spot on the map if you're a member of this subscription service. Unit and species searches, different search criteria to where you can go on there and essentially buy trail camera images. Here's another one that literally offers to sell a location of an animal. You can click on one of these spots here that says, whatever kind of an animal it is and roughly where it's located. You can click on that purchase button and it pops up who the seller is, what the animal is, where it's located, and how much it costs to buy the location of where that photo was taken. So like I said, at least a decade ago, we were looking at trail camera language. I think the commission, at least 10 or 12 years ago, asked us to draft some trail camera language. It's evolved through several different drafts. This most recent draft, I worked on at length with some of the members of this board and prior Chairman Drew. And when we got it back from LCB, it looked quite a bit different than what we had sent them. But if you break it down into plain language, it basically says 3 things. It says that a person shall not place, maintain, or use a trail camera in any way that prevents or alters the way wildlife accesses water. That's sort of just a general that if your camera is obstructing access to water, that should be illegal. Second part, a person shall not place, maintain, or use a trail camera within 200 feet of a spring, water hole, or artificial water basin that collects or is designed to collect water and in a closed period, similar to the trail camera regulation. So that a person shouldn't be allowed to do that between August 1st and December 31st, have a camera within 200 feet of water. The third point says a person shall not place, maintain, or use a trail camera at any place, regardless of that water tie, if it's a transmitting camera from August 1st to December 31st. So essentially what it says is you can still use a camera as long as it's outside of August 1st to December 31st, or if you're using it during that time frame, it can't be a transmitting camera and it can't be within 200 feet of water. So that was language sort of agreed upon with prior chairman. There are a couple adjustments and some tweaks that could be considered. One being the distance from the water. Going to some of the cabs and reading some of the cab action reports, it sounds like there's a lot of feeling that 200 feet is not far enough. And there was some concern about building brush funnels and trying to funnel animals past your camera. And then also the consistency with our camping near waterhole law. NRS 503-660 basically just says it's unlawful to camp within 100 yards of one of these water sources. So in the interest of consistency to that law, 100 yards rather than 200 feet may be an option. And then there was a lot of discussion that I heard coming from cabs about the dates. And one of the key points there is that the trail camera closure season or restricted season would begin on August 1st, but that's also the opening date of the heritage tags and silver state tags. So I heard a fair amount of discussion about bringing that a little bit earlier, like to mid-July. Of course, this time of year, bucks and bulls and rams are on the move and maybe not tied to one spot, but when these seasons open on August 1st, those bucks and bulls are pretty much tied to one water source. They're not going very far. So it's pretty effective. There are some exemptions in the regulation that several people asked for, several groups asked for, and as you'd expect, these exemptions are fairly controversial because it's difficult to draw a line of limiting the use of these cameras for something that seems to be too aggressive of a use, or sort of try to prevent or curtail the bad uses but still allow the good uses, because clearly they're really a good tool for us, for land managers, for ranchers, for mining, So we built some exemptions in there, but of course with those exemptions comes the controversy that people bring up about the exemptions. So the first one would exempt local, state, or federal employees acting within the scope of their official duties, and if they're using cameras marked with who owns them. This one's a little bit controversial from the standpoint of if we're using a camera to monitor use of a guzzler or to try to get a better handle on calf crop in an elk herd or fawn recruitment, you know, any list of a long list of reasons that we might use them as a department. You know, Habitat may use them for water developments, Diversity may use them for their species coming in. But with that comes some scrutiny that says, you know, a lot of people in NDOW hunt. Are they going to be using trail cameras for their own benefit? And I don't know if Director Wasley wants to jump in here and speak for the whole department, but I guess to that I would just say that we will address that internally. We got a directive years ago about aerial surveys as they relate to our own personal hunts, that the two shall not mix, and I think we could easily expand that into camera use. Sort of like our statute that passed 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, about protection of our data, aerial survey data and satellite collar data. We protect the locations of those animals for 1 year and don't give that out to the public. And that applies both to someone outside the agency inquiring about records, but it also applies to our own people. Say, you know, if I have a deer tag in Area 13, I'm not going to call up the Area 13 biologist and say, hey, what does your collar data show? So I don't know if anybody wants to elaborate on that or not, but.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I might, we've had some discussion around some of the criticisms we've heard, and this isn't the first time we've heard some of those criticisms. They've been levied at some of our biologists who have tags and also have access to helicopters to do surveys with which to perform their professional duties. One of the things that we've done is we've been very conscious of that public perception. I can think of several examples. One that comes to mind immediately is Pat Cummins had a sheep tag a couple years ago, and he purposely removed himself from his survey activities and had his peers perform those surveys. So we've been very sensitive to it. It is challenging for us to do our job and have access to those tools that allow us to do our jobs the best way that we can, and then also deal with some of those public perceptions. One of the items that we discussed recently amongst the leadership team is perhaps developing an internal policy that speaks to the professional conduct in a way that would at least address some of those public perceptions head on. At the end of the day, regardless, I mean, we have people, game wardens, who are being paid to drive around hunt areas, and just by virtue of the encounters they have with men and women in the field and familiarity they have, there's going to be knowledge that would be a benefit in pursuing game should they be fortunate enough to have a tag. There's no way that we'll be able to completely remove some of the benefits associated with doing our job and their carryover, whether it's chucker distribution, big game distribution. That's a unavoidable reality. However, we'd be willing to draft an internal policy that would go beyond just the use of trail cameras, certainly collar data, aerial surveys, to try to deal with some of those public perceptions that some of those data or tools could be misused by employees to gain an unfair advantage. So it just, you know, didn't want to ignore some of those criticisms and perceptions, and I doubt that the existence of that policy would fully alleviate some of those concerns, but it would be best good faith effort on our part to address them, acknowledge them, and provide some direction in terms of professional conduct. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Director Wasley. Questions from the commission, or do you?
We can just go a few more through the exemptions.
I saw it disappear. I didn't know if we were done.
Oh, no problem. Chief Game Warden Tyler Turnipseed for the record again. Second exemption built in there would be members of a recognized wildlife conservation organization to monitor water use. Where that one comes from is, of course, we have, sportsmen's groups who are very active in building water developments. You can list them: Fraternity Desert Bighorn, NBU, Pershing County, Muley, the list goes on and on. And those groups have been extremely beneficial to wildlife in Nevada, extremely beneficial to big game. And a lot of what they do is build water. Obviously, we're the driest state in the nation, and those groups are key in developing water sources. So like a specific example that comes to mind, Mel Belding was vocal about this one at the Washoe Cab meeting, and all the experience and the knowledge that he's gained over the years from the use of trail cameras dictates how our guzzler fences are built nowadays and how the drinkers are constructed. The Habitat Division can speak to that as well, but so trail cameras can be very beneficial. So we built that exemption in there. There again, it's been controversial a little bit because people have asked, well, what is a recognized wildlife conservation organization? What does it take to be recognized? Can I just start up a group that says, middle-aged bald guys for the conservation of bighorn sheep, and then does that allow me to go out and set up trail cameras? So there's been some discussion about that. The next exemption, private property, sort of comes back to the same stuff we were talking about with sheds. Do we have the authority, or does this board want the authority to regulate trail cameras on privately owned property? The intersection of private property rights versus the wildlife disturbance piece. Fourth exemption, cameras used to monitor livestock use on a water source. There again, this kind of goes back to livestock industry, but maybe in addition to on their private land, I've certainly heard of ranchers using a trail camera to monitor, are my cows using this spring on such and such an allotment that they may not own but they lease. And then the last one there isn't in the regulation, but the Nevada Mining Association reached out to us and asked if we would also put in an exemption in there for a trail camera on a mine site so that they could monitor wildlife and or livestock use on a mine site. And we told them, from my standpoint, I would consider that a friendly amendment, but it would obviously be up to this board. So those are the exemptions that we're considering in this, but again, with the exemptions comes some controversy. So I'd stand for questions on that. Again, it's one of those issues in which we have half the people shouting at us when you do something about these trail cameras that are out of control, and the other half saying, "Why are you trying to restrict my use of a good thing here?"
Questions for Chief Turnipseed? Comments before I take it out to public comment?
Wow.
Okay. Seeing none, I'll take it out to public comment in Las Vegas on agenda item number 7.
No. Yes, we have comment, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Jana Wright for the record. It appears this regulation is focused on water sources, so I would recommend that we follow staff's recommendation. Other than I would delete on page 2, number 2B, about the recognized wildlife conservation organization. That just doesn't set well with me, but I think having a season for trail cameras certainly is in order. So thank you for allowing me to comment.
Stephanie Myers for the record, Las Vegas. I would agree that it's very difficult to define a recognized wildlife conservation organization. And of course, the main concern has got to be with the quality of life for the wildlife. And that needs to be the main criterion for any decision. Thank you.
That concludes comment, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Las Vegas. I'll bring it back to Carson City for public comment. Come on up.
Kevin Crow with Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. I'm not going to get into any of the controversy. I think all the exemptions are perfectly reasonable. The water hole issue, which seems to be the main focus of controversy, I'm not touching on whatsoever. Backcountry Hunters and Anglers thinks this is an extremely reasonable regulation. It's well written. It's a very good compromise. If you want to use trail cams, you can use them. You just have to go get the images. What we don't want, what is certainly not in the spirit of fair chase, And what is touched on directly in the regulation is that transmission of images or video. If someone's sitting in their fifth wheel watching a TV screen and then they say, oh, there's a big elk, I'll go shoot it. Clearly that's not fair chase hunting practices. But if they still want to go get the images from a trail cam, that's fine. On that note, that's where we need to change in language with this, because the actual intent and focus of this regulation is not people getting images and video of big game. That's fine if people want to do that. It's the live or real-time transmission of game locating data, which Tyler Turnipseed so very clearly pointed out when he pointed out the geolocation that people pay for with these apps. You know, all these new technologies that keep coming about, previously discussing trail cams, the live transmission wasn't an issue. Now it is, because technology has evolved, and that's the fair chase issue. So making a simple change in the wording, section 1B1, where it says live images or video, that could simply be stricken and changed to game locating data. And that would solve all the problem, because currently we have technology that can send a video. Who's to say the next generation won't just send me a text message? That wouldn't be protected by this regulation, and it would still serve the same purpose. It's that game locating data, the live transmission of it, that is contrary to fair hunting traditions. So by eliminating that, I think we make this regulation really tight. Now, of course, in following, by making that one change to game locating data, it also necessitates going through the regulation and, where applicable, changing trail cam, which is far too specific of a word, to device or game locating device, which is in fact what they are. If we focus purely on image transmission, this regulation won't be very effective or very long lasting. Thank you.
Thank you. Further public comment? Coming up, Corey.
For the record, Corey Lytle, Lincoln Cab. We had several changes to this. I don't know if it's in you guys' backup material. I'd like to go through a couple things and kind of explain the reason for some of our recommended changes, and I'll try to be as clear and concise as I can. We want to go for the throat on this. This is something that's completely out of hand. To put it into plain context, it's ridiculous. Our wildlife are being sold. There's a price on their head the second an image hits a camera. These cameras are staying out there year-round now, 12 months out of the year. That picture you saw, the head chaining there at Barnes Canyon, there'll be a half a dozen of those cameras stay there year-round. As soon as a big buck walks into view, he's got a price on his head. This needs to come in, and we're kind of going for the throat on this. For the first portion, we actually recommended taking out section 1A and 1B. So it would read, section 1 would read, a person shall not place, maintain, or use a trail camera. And we go down to, in a wildlife management area in the unit of the state of the camera transmit or is capable of transmitting images or video to another location, okay? It's the real time. And then we modify number 2 with B, and so we add within 200 feet of a spring, water source, or artificial basin, during the period beginning January 1 and ending July of 31. So we want a 200-foot setback the first 7 months out of the year. And speaking for myself, the 300-foot setback isn't a bad thing. So then there would be a subsection C there. In any management area or unit within the state during the period beginning August 1 and ending December 31. So from August 1st to the end of the year, none at all. The first 7 months out of the year, we say you can set them, but you're going to set them, you know, with a recommended setback distance or a required setback distance. Section 2, as far as the exemptions go, we want to take out the conservation organization exemption. I think that's just a can of worms. Anybody can belong to any organization they want with whatever good intention they want. If they want to go out as part of a recognized organization, then they can set their camera 300 feet from water. That's the way we look at it. Keep in the private property exemption and then eliminate the livestock exemption. most of those guys, if they've got it on their private property anyway. So we thought exemptions B and D should go, and I'd be happy to take any questions if you guys are unsure of what we recommended.
Questions for Corey? Commissioner Barnes.
I have one, Corey, and I saw it on your recommendation on elimination of the livestock, just on public ground. I was kind of curious about, where you were coming from there.
My personal opinion on that is if you have an allotment and you have a range improvement, you own that range improvement, that's your private property. And if you want to put a camera there, it's yours. If it's somebody else's, they don't necessarily have your permission to do it. So it's your prerogative or whatever it may be to remove that camera. I think as soon as we start getting into whether there's a permitted water use or anything, I think some of that's going to rely directly on the permittee and that direction. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I understand. That's why I asked, because I was wondering if that's what...
So in my opinion, that's private property in my opinion.
It is, and a lot of those springs we have and are filed on, we have, that's a property right for that water.
Yeah, you saw in the one picture those stock tanks. Those are private property. Even though they're on public land, those stock tanks are private. And if the range operator or the owner of that private property doesn't want his 20 cameras there, or some hunter's 20 cameras there, then they should have the ability to move those off those stock tanks. And to me, those exemptions cover that. That's my opinion. Anyway, that's why we kept the private property exemption and removed the livestock exemption.
Further comments in Carson City?
For the record, Paul Dixon, Clark Cab. Not to repeat a lot of what's been said, because we agree with a lot of it. One is that when you have a continuously or live streaming trail camera and you have multiple ones in an area, it's effectively equivalent to a drone or an aerial survey device, which we already outlaw. So why we wouldn't make that, now that we have the technology, just cover that piece of it, because that seems pretty straightforward to us. The other thing is that as opposed to most other counties in this state, Clark County, I would say a majority of the cameras put out in Clark County are put out by non-consumptive users. They're not put out by people who are hunters or fishermen. They're people putting out trail cameras in the sheep mountains so their kids can look at the sheep coming to the water supply or into the muddies. And they're sitting in classrooms where teachers use them every day, where kids can see live streaming what's coming in, to a thing. And so there's a concern here, because there's a lot of non-consumptive use of trail cameras, at least in southern Nevada, where the majority of the population is not hunting and fishing. So that when we put this rule together, we have to make sure that we don't inadvertently do something that really inhibits their ability to do stuff. So live streaming maybe not there, but have them transmit still pictures or something that doesn't have GPS locating, real-time images. We agree with the 200 feet or more from a water source, just because I know from hunting, when you're archery hunting, there's a lot of people coming in and attracting film off their cameras. And to be honest with you, I archery hunted 9 days, and 4 of the 9 days I watched people come into water sources where there were animals and chase them off from a distance. Midday elk wallowing in a wallow, I'm 1,000 yards off, but I watched guys drive in and kick the elk out so they could get their stuff in the middle of the day. And to be honest with you, other restrictions on trail camera use, if they're not live streaming, I don't see the value in that, just because of the non-consumptive use that we see in Clark County. So maybe come to Brad saying certain counties or something, but to be honest with you, there are a lot of people out there who use trail cameras which are not hunters or fishermen right now, at least when you live in a big city like Nevada, where most of the kids never see the outdoors, and the outdoors they see comes from pictures that their teachers bring into the classroom or the things their parents do. Thank you.
Joe Krim, Persian Cab, and again, I apologize for not getting those minutes in so you could get my comments. It was pretty cut and dry at our meeting. The decision at the meeting was either cameras or no cameras. No in-betweens, no consensus for anything. Up north where we're at, we don't have the issue with the cameras like they do down south, and I sympathize with Corey and those guys, I do, but we just felt that we didn't want one organization to have the advantage to use the cameras, but not the general public also. We didn't want anybody to have an unfair advantage. And we did hear that at our CAB meeting, that the department would always know where all the animals were. True or not, it's irrelevant, but we did hear that. But no matter which way this goes, I'm going to speak on a personal issue, because I know that 2 of you were on the board when my son was still in high school. And he did a project for 3 years in high school, then he qualified with that project to go to a national competition off of pictures that he had taken while he was in school. So whatever direction you go here, I don't want you to limit it so the general public or a high school kid that's doing a project doesn't lose the ability to still do a project, if that's what they choose. So just something to think about as you're going through this, that everybody is not using the cameras for hunting like Paul had said. There's still non-consumptive users who are doing different types of programs with these cameras. So there are some beneficial uses and some detrimental uses, but just keep that in mind when you're going through this, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Crum.
Shane Bourne, White Pine County Cab. Again, same as the shed horns. We met with Corey and a couple other members on October 19th and discussed shed horns and trail cameras at the same time. The language developed here, we developed together that Corey sent to you, and we're in 100% agreement with only one exception, and that was the 200 feet. And we believe, as we met later, that it should be 300 feet to coincide with the camping on water and other regulations within NDOW. The private party issue, we did not want to touch the private party issue. We didn't feel there was any way that we could, that it could be addressed. We understand that it's going to be a big problem because in Area 22 in Cave Valley, almost every water source is private. But to regulate that, we felt, was outside of our means. The members of the recognized wildlife conservative organizations, we agreed with Corey to throw that out. And like Mr. Turnipseed said, he said it perfect. The list goes on and on and on. And if you leave it in there, I understand the good points to having it in there for different organizations, but you're going to water down this rule so bad it's not even going to be worth having. And that was our opinion. As far as the rest of the provisions, we thought that they should stay, and the biggest reason was law enforcement. It was brought up that NDI uses this for grow operations and sting operations, and we cannot take that tool away from them. That's why we felt that those provisions should stay for state and local governments. That's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shane.
Mr. Chairman, Board, Gene Green, Carson City Cab. We read through the information and voted to support it the way it was. Our main concern was over the education and the research issues, that those should maybe be more defined so that they are exempt, especially for students and researchers. That was our only concern for it here. We aren't affected in this area like a lot of the other places are. And we felt that might be a little better wording there. But other than that, we voted to support the whole thing because it is a change in technology that every other year we're going to be looking at again anyway. So we got to start jumping on it now before it does get completely out of hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Gene. Further public comment in Carson City? There you go.
Thank you. I'm sort of hard to teach an old dog new tricks. You've heard from our member, Kevin Crow, who came up with a really interesting and I think very serious addition to the language. And certainly that's something that our BHA chapter, local chapter, will be considering advocating to you, and I hope you'll give that some serious consideration today. We haven't had a chance to consider it as a board. But that said, we did submit our comments to you. I know you know that we have a national position related to the real-time cams, trail cams, for their use, prohibiting their use for hunting and scouting purposes, that we're in support of regulations related to that. But of course, devil's always in the details. But what occurred to me when I was sitting here listening to all of the exemptions and some of the concerns about the exemptions is a question. You know, it's only been in the last decade or so that the real-time cams have really become and proliferated in use. Would it be much of a hindrance to say that during that space of time that we sportsmen are precluded from using the real-time trail cam, that those with the exemptions would be relegated to the old style, or does that break up some study that had started in real time and can't transition to the old style that has just the, you know, where you have to pull out the card? Just something to think about. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Coming up, Corey.
I apologize for the record again, Corey Lytle, Lincoln Cab. Just a couple of the points I wanted to make to kind of enforce our recommendations on those calendar dates. From January 1 to July 31st, you get into the heat of the summer on these isolated water sources. In these areas where you have multiple cameras, 10, 12, 14 cameras. Next year it'll be 15, 20, 25 cameras. The picture of Acoma had 32 on it. One of my cab members touched 32 cameras there. The idea behind that are these guys are coming in and out of there, checking their cameras on a constant basis. Sometimes it might be a month interval, sometimes closer to hunting season, it's going to be like once a week. And they're coming at all hours of the night, all hours of the day, and it's just this constant bombardment on these water sources. And where they're isolated, it compounds the problem. Places where there's a lot more water distributed a lot more, it's not as big a deal. And so that's one of the main arguments we had for that earlier setback and restriction going to the end of July. From August 1 to the end of the year, it was a direct tie to hunting and the ethics behind hunting and being able to have that extra data. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to clarify that.
No problem. Thank you, Corey. Further comment in Carson City?
Steve Marcus, White Pine County Board. As board member Bourne did state, I do work at the local sporting goods store, and it's kind of the hub for all the sportsmen and the outdoorsmen. Everybody comes in. So when I'm in there, I take a barrage of comments, and I have yet to see a person come in favor of using trail cams. Everybody is tired of it. We're overrun with them. And to go back to the shed thing, it's the same thing. I take it constantly, which is fine. It's, I'm on their board. I will represent them best I can, but we do need to get something done. They're thoroughly upset with guides coming in and dropping 30, 40 cameras, leaving. Then they come in, pick the deer they want, send out 10 guys, surround it, kill it, gone. We need something done. So, thank you.
Thank you. Further comment? One more thing, Shane? Turn your mic on. The little face, there you go.
Oh, okay. Sorry. The element of harassment with trail cameras. You know, if you only have 2 cameras and 2 flashes go off, it may not bother an animal. If you have 30 cameras and 30 flashes going off at the same time, anybody that has used trail cameras and saw 2 pictures of a deer, and the first picture, he's jumping right straight in the air, and the second picture, all you can see is his tail in a cloud of dust. That deer, if it's on running water, he'll go down 100 yards, 200 yards, he'll water in a different spot because he doesn't like it. If it's on a guzzler, if it's on ponded water, he may not come back. Now, if you multiply that and run it out to 100 cameras, which it'll be pretty quick, now what's going to happen to that water source and what's going to happen to that deer or that elk that absolutely cannot stand 100 flashes going off? It is a form of harassment in my mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane. Further comment in Carson City? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission for questions or comments. Commissioner Allenberg.
Yeah, I'll start this off. I agree with the way it's written. I also agree with a lot of the changes that they recommend. But one thing's for sure is I do believe we have to start somewhere. And I don't have, a whole lot of issues with the way it's written. And again, I don't have a whole lot of issues with tightening up the language on the modernization of the cameras, because that will continue to evolve. And we want to stop it somewhere. And I think that's where, no matter where it evolves from here on out, we don't want no part of it, to keep things simple. So that's where I stand.
Commissioner Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I remember about 4 or 5 years ago, this first came up, and I was a proponent of 0 trail cameras. I backed off of that a little bit, and I'll go with Mr. Lytle's recommendation, and I think that's about where we need to be, having a lot of personal knowledge of what goes on in those hunting areas around there. And they're ruining the hunting, and their ethics are all screwed up. And thank you, Corey, for your comments, and all the other cabs that support the same thoughts.
Thank you, Commissioner Young. Vice Chairman Johnston.
Yeah, I guess just a question, and Mr. Lytle, I tried to take it down as you were giving it, and Commissioner Young, as I understood it, what you guys were saying, or recommendation would be, there would be no use of trail cameras in a wildlife management area or unit at this state from August 1 to December 31, and then within 300 feet of a spring, water source, or I'll just use guzzler rather than the lengthy definition in the reg, from January 1 to July 31. Did I get that right? Oh, even better, thank you.
Further comments or questions? Commissioner Barnes.
I guess I have a question for Tyler. I agreed with Corey, but as I read the section 2C, a trail camera placed, maintained, or used on private property with the permission of the landowner. In your mind, does that clarify water sources? Let's say a BLM or Forest Service permit? Or do you think we need to clarify that just a little bit more in there?
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner Barnes. I think there is some ambiguity there because, yeah, it gets into a whole nother body of law on a water development on public land. And you're right, a lot of them are on private land when there's a homesteaded 40 or whatever, they're at a water source. But yeah, the ones that are actually on public land, but the water development that was put in by the rancher, whether it be stock tanks or pipeline or whatever, that improvement is probably owned by the rancher. But yeah, it does create some ambiguity there. If the camera is attached to the trough, then it's probably on private property, but it's I don't know, 50 feet off the trough or 100 feet off the trough? Is it then on public property? And you know, I think there's some ambiguity there that we'd probably need to clean up somehow.
Yeah, I guess the question I should have asked to begin with is that maybe we still need to leave D in there, just to clarify, because I think D is specific to that as far as stock water. Because I know a lot of guys now are starting to put them, but they're putting them right on the trough so that they can check and make sure that there's actually water in the troughs without having to go check them every other day. So I guess that's the question, is would it be better if we left that in there for clarification for that purpose?
It would certainly make it clearer. And LCB added the part about a permit issued by the state engineer. I think that tightens it down a little bit further to where it's a permitted stock water right rather than you know, a spring that's not appropriated or whatever. I'm speaking a little bit out of my realm of knowledge again, but yeah, I think it clears it up a little bit rather than trying to figure out what's private property and what's not.
Commissioner Hubbs.
I just was thinking offhand, the way that this is written, do you think this is really getting at the fact that we have individuals grabbing locations of wildlife and posting them online for sale? Because even in the off-season, they're going to be doing that. I don't see how that's stopping that problem.
It's a great question. Thank you, Commissioner Wallace or Chairman Wallace and Commissioner Hubbs. And you're right. So some of those websites that have popped up in recent years, some of them specialize in trail camera photos. You know, the one you can join and subscribe to their trail camera network for an annual subscription. And with that annual subscription, you can pull up a water, you know, they may have several hundred water sources covered with a camera. And if you join their group or their service, for that fee, you can check all those cameras in that network. So that one is specifically tied to trail cameras. There's a little bit bigger issue that I think you reference about just selling locations of animals, period. That second website that was in the PowerPoint has probably uses some trail camera stuff, but also just, you know, if I see an elk in you know, such and such a canyon, I can post that on that website and sell the location of that elk. Probably a much bigger conversation than what this deals with. But yeah, this dealing with the camera issue, the selling location of animals, the camera issue is a part of that, but that's also a part of a much bigger conversation. This conversation about animals coming to water, you know, of course in other states they use trail cameras, but there's water everywhere, so an animal can avoid trail cameras if need be. But like Mr. Bourne said from White Pine County, in some of these drier units, you know, you can cover an entire hunt unit with say a dozen cameras, which in my opinion is probably way more effective than flying. You know, in some of our desert units, if you can literally get a picture of every single big game animal in that unit with a handful of cameras and use that during the hunt, like that animal has lost his ability to avoid detection because he has to go to water, especially in August. So this regulation, sort of the authority for it or the reason for it is two-pronged. And it's relevant because we discussed this with LCB on the authority that this board has to regulate wildlife issues. The prior draft that came out of this used the clause for the purposes of hunting, which is important for some of the testimony about non-consumptive uses, you know, school kids or people that monitor feral horses or whatever. But the concern there was if we specify that we're going to make it illegal to use these for the purposes of hunting, which is language from our flight law, then there's going to be a giant burden of proof on us to prove that they're being used for hunting. So, you know, you imagine the scenario of someone who's trying to beat the system and says, okay, I've got 30 trail cameras out. I do have a tag for that area, but I'm not using my cameras for that. I use them because I want to see how many mountain bluebirds are using those springs. All of a sudden now we've lost our burden of proof in proving that they're using those cameras illegally. So talking to the lawyers at LCB, I said, do you think the Wildlife Commission has the authority to just say, we're going to make it illegal to place, set, or maintain a camera, period, regardless of the use? And in talking it over with them, they said, yeah, I think you do, because there's a fair chase issue when you're talking about hunting. But that's not, and so the Wildlife Commission can regulate the fair chase issue. There's also a wildlife disturbance issue, like the discussion about camera flashes going off, and cameras are getting better to where they don't flash, but if a camera is being used to monitor mountain bluebirds coming to a spring, it's still disturbing wildlife coming to that spring, or that's the assumption. And some people have argued that, especially with bighorn sheep, because bighorn sheep will come right up in water while you're digging a hole with a backhoe, like they're really not afraid. But an 8-year-old mule deer or a big bull elk or something, you know, is going to come to that spring, and 1 camera, 10 cameras, 20 cameras eventually move off that spring to go somewhere else, but then run out of spring alternate water sources to go to. So I'm rambling a little bit, but my point there is that the reason for this is bifurcated into 2 completely different reasons. One being the fair chase issue of, is it fair to be able to have a camera on every water and check them during the hunt? That's the fair chase hunt issue. Then there's the wildlife disturbance issue of affecting the way wildlife comes to water. And that's the point where LCB asserts that you do have the authority to regulate that regardless of what the camera is being used for. So it takes away that burden of proof on used for the purposes of hunting. That was a giant rambling answer that I didn't mean to go that long.
Commissioner Valentine.
Chief Turnipseed, I was wondering, you know, when we're discussing some of the conservation organizations and other individuals using trail cameras on some of the guzzlers and stuff like Paul brought up, would it be too big of a burden to have a permitting process through the department to allow those individuals to acquire those permits to put the on a particular guzzler during a certain period of time?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Wallace and Commissioner Valentine. I think that is an option. I heard it discussed at some of the cabs to where, you know, some of these exemptions that, as was discussed, it kind of waters down the law and takes some of the teeth out of it. But one of the ways to help that might be some sort of a special permit system. And I hate to speak for the license office saying that we could take on another special permit, especially at a time when we're trying to simplify and shrink that down. But I think that is an option to where it might be a way to tighten some of those loopholes a little bit, to where if you're a wildlife conservation group who truly is wanting to monitor, you know, water use to determine how far apart the fence rails should be spaced or how the drinker should be constructed or something, if you're really doing that in good faith, then you should be okay with getting a permit from us to do it. And I'm sure we could probably do it for free and you know, something that, I don't want to use the word registration because that's a rabbit hole we don't want to go down, but a way to document whose camera that is and what it's being used for.
And I might add, it could be very similar to like a scientific collection permit, where presently we permit researchers to take certain specimens. They're required to submit an application for that permit. We evaluate the merits of their research, and they're also required to submit a report at the conclusion. So it contributes to the general body of knowledge in a broader way.
Vice Chairman Johnston.
Isn't that type of permitting process, so we're going to end up with what is or was not a wildlife conservation group? I mean, in the time we have this debate, I can get on the Secretary of State's website and I'll have a new entity established. It'll be done, I can do it in 10 minutes. Be completely registered as a nonprofit, maybe not with the IRS, but a state entity, legally recognized entity. I can say it's a conservation group, give me my permit. And if money is driving this, the number of cameras in the field so that then they're broadcasting the images out as we see, it seems to me you might end up, and then we're back with a whole nother set of issues of, well, why did the fraternity or Nevada Bighorns Unlimited get a permit and my group didn't? I see that creating a host of other issues potentially, just because it is quite easy to create an organization if you want to do it, and it's not much money, especially in this state. They have made it very, very easy to do that. Our Secretary of State's office, rightfully so. I'm not being critical of that, but it is very easy task to do.
It's Definitely concerned. Like I said, I could go out tomorrow and start the group, you know, middle-aged balls guys for bighorn sheep or whatever, and then go out and put cameras out. So certainly that is a concern. And the permitting process through the department, it would be a way to tighten down on that, but you're right, it would cause some controversy over which group gets a permit, which doesn't, which group is made up of hunters who might use that information for more than research, which group isn't, raises a lot of questions.
Commissioner Hubbs.
Just going back to what the gentleman from the backcountry hunters mentioned in terms of the location of the wildlife, it's just, I keep thinking about that because we've had long discussions about keeping certain data confidential over periods of time for the protection of wildlife, but yet what we have is independent individuals going out and getting that data on their own, essentially, and then making that public or commercializing it. So for me, I'm more apt to just say, what is the purpose of having these trail cameras if they're causing grave harm? I mean, is there a reason to really have them for a hunting perspective at all at this time? I mean, what I haven't heard today is it's a good thing for hunting. I mean, because if it's, maybe we don't have trail cameras for hunting. I mean, because I mean, back in the day, you used to have to go out and find your, you know, your prey that you were going to go hunt for in a month or two. I mean, it sounds like we've got, you know, satellite imagery of game all over the state, and we're picking and choosing, and it just seems almost absurd at some point.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chairman Wallace and Commissioner Hubbs. The last slide on this PowerPoint is an excerpt from a Boone and Crockett essay about fair chase, and it talks about technology becoming a substitute for basic skills. And I refer back to this when we're talking about all kinds of these technology issues. Because, you know, sometimes we get criticized for coming up with new regulations all the time. Well, we wouldn't need to come up with any new regulations if the technology wasn't expanding exponentially, you know, every year. 20 years ago, we never dreamed we'd be talking about being able to sit in your RV and have a picture pop up on your phone because a big buck just watered. You know, that was science fiction 20 years ago or 30 years ago. When trail cameras first came out, they had film in them, and you had to go get the film out of the camera and take it down to Walmart and get it developed. So the leaps at which it's growing is pretty amazing. But you're right, it waters down the basic woodsmanship skills that hunting should be about, and you know, the pursuit of the animal on his terms. So yeah, totally agree. It's a technology thing that may or may not have a place in hunting. To speak to the disturbance piece, if I can elaborate, it kind of goes back to your question on sheds as well, because no doubt we'll get challenged like, well, prove to me that cameras are having a negative effect on wildlife. And I don't know that proof is out there. I don't know that anybody has done a study with a camera trying to monitor how a deer responds to a camera. You know, I don't know that we can quantify the damage that cameras do to wildlife. I think it's just assumed that when a deer is coming into a water hole getting his picture taken, it's going to change the way he behaves in some way.
Right, and I just was going to say, obviously some time ago we felt that 100 yards was the limit for camping. I mean, and that's not just some arbitrary decision. I mean, it just seems like a reasonable decision, especially in an arid environment, that you're getting too close to something they have to come to. At some point they have to get water or they will die. So we're putting them in a position where they're going to be scouted out across the state just for getting water. It just sounds really, I don't know, extreme to me. So I understand the exception portion and wanting to see wildlife and educational purposes and individuals who have property at risk, things of that nature. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, are we sitting here dissecting whether or not we need it for hunting when maybe the question is it proper to have it for hunting at all? And I'm not hearing it's a good thing for hunting at this point. I have not heard one person say that today.
That's an excellent point, and I thought it was interesting when I copied and pasted that camping near waterhole law. I looked, and that law was written in 1975. So clearly before anyone ever dreamed of trail cameras, but even then they recognized the fact that if you come in and set up your camp on a spring or a stock tank, and all of a sudden wildlife and livestock both, all of a sudden they can't come to water, like that's not a good thing. We don't want that happening. So they recognized that in '75, and here we are 42 years later talking about the next step in that progression.
Vice Chairman Johnston.
I think part of the challenge, though, is that even if, let's say you said we want to ban trail cameras for use in connection with hunting, it creates the enforcement issue. If you said trail cameras should not be used in hunting big game in the state of Nevada, then you still have trail cameras out in the field. People say, well, I really wasn't using it for my hunt. I was using it for this purpose or just to take photos or whatever. And then you have an enforcement dilemma.
Not if the ones that are out there are permitted. They have some type of permit that backs up the purpose with the state as to why they're there for taping wildlife or watching wildlife. I mean, then you can go back and report it. It would be on it, or you would have some either marker or number, and the state would be aware of its presence and the purpose. And it would have to fall under like an exemption as to why it's there.
That would go to any use of a trail camera would have to be permitted by the department.
Commissioner Holmberg.
I don't think we can ever get away from the fact that, as been brought up, that it's kind of a whole deal of its own beyond hunting. I mean, it's very popular with a lot of people, consumptive and non-consumptive, children, kids, you know, the people get excited about placing them and going and checking them, and that's why we got a problem with them beyond just for the commercialization. And that's an issue that I have a problem with, is, you know, by impacting them for hunting purposes, we're also negatively impacting them for people that are just enjoy using them, period. And there's a lot of them. It's not a small segment of trail cam users. There's a lot of people that just plain and simple like to get pictures of, you know, see if they can get a bobcat, see if they can get a lion, you know, whatever. They really enjoy setting them. And that's a very difficult thing for me to take that away from that group that's not abusing them.
But those groups, just to interject, those groups, even though they're having fun doing that, they could be still harming wildlife, because we're stating that if they're at the water hole and the flash is coming on, at some point we have to assume that that might not be a good thing for them, or that their behavior might be modified. And I don't know what the percentage or proportion is, but to me, I was understanding some of the representation was that the majority were placed there for hunting purposes, and that there's these ancillary purposes for children with education occasionally. If that's the case, I could see a permitting process where it's not excessive, but from what you're telling me, that it's kind of a mixture, or is it more hunting?
The problem is, is hunting. It is a mixture. In my mind, it's a mixture. There's plenty of people that use it for just, that's what they like to do. They like to go out and they like to set to trail cams and they like to get pictures of stuff, and they don't create a problem in the same perspective, because, you know, if they've seen a trail cam, they're not likely to go set 20 to take a picture of that one animal or to get the biggest. They're just out there trying to get pictures in general. And so I do have a tough time impacting those people. I don't know what percentages, but there's plenty. You know, in my mind, there's plenty of them.
Further commission questions? Commissioner Hubbs?
Well, there's also photography. I mean, you could go out and take pictures of wildlife that's not disturbing them too. It's not like that's not like we're saying you can't go out and enjoy wildlife and take a photo of them if it's a non-invasive way to do so.
But I think at the same time, what's the difference of the person standing there that's taking a picture of the wildlife in the camera? I mean, you can argue this from hundreds of different angles, but I mean, to me, the family that takes their camera out and sticks it on to take some pictures, and the excitement of the kids to come back and go, oh, what do we get, what do we get? Versus the person that was out with the same camera, they're still disrupting the wildlife. I think just as much as a camera that's sitting there. The people being there is just as disruptive to me. So, I mean, we're kind of on the slippery slope type of thing. And I see where Commissioner Holmberg is coming from. And in fact, I can remember sitting, I don't know that it was in this room, but Commissioner Bliss, his kids loved doing that. And he had the same thing when we were discussing it, was his kids loved to do that. It was the hobby that they had. It had nothing to do with hunting. They were out, they wanted pictures of the animals. And I come back to that as well, and it's hard to do that, but at the same time, somewhere you have to draw the line in the sand and say, this is enough is enough.
Well, just if it's a quantity, if it's the quantity that's the issue, then we could look at only a certain amount can be out there, period. I mean, if you don't want to get rid of it, then you have to allow it and minimize it.
Further commissioner comments? We have some direction to go.
So in reading back through White Pines, it was basically 3 prohibitions. No trail cameras if they were capable of or transmitted imagery or data. No trail cameras regardless of whether they have transmitting ability within 300 feet of water source from January 1 to July 31, and then no trail cams whatsoever from August 1st to 12/31. I just think that's just a fair compromise, and the reason being is you can go put out all the trail cameras you want, except from 8/1 to 12/31, which is the hunting season. But the rest of the year, for 7 months out of the year, just keep them away from the water holes so you're not disrupting the animals off the water. That seems to me a fair compromise to try to address this, let people have their hobbies and do things, keep them out of the hunting season, but certainly not take away the ability for the general public to set trail cams and get wildlife photos for 7 months out of the year. I mean, that's a long period of time in which they can do it. Just saying don't do it within 300 feet of a guzzler or spring, just in the same way you don't camp that close to a water source. I think that's a fairly reasonable approach to take, especially if we're having an issue with the number of cameras out there and then people visiting those cameras so many times that it does disrupt the wildlife.
Okay, I think we pretty much have ended the discussion in that, but I think we need to get and work through this and have something that we can bring back. And I saw a lot of shaking heads on the dates that Commissioner Johnston came up with. But I think we also need to look
White
at
Pine and Lincoln Cabs came up with that I think I'm repeating, so I don't want to take credit for the work that they did.
Agreed.
Did you read theirs verbatim just now, Brad? Is that what you read, Corey's?
Yeah, if I understood Corey and Mr. Boren's proposal, it was that there's not going to be use of any trail cams or similar devices that transmit imagery or data any time of the year. Regular trail cams that take photos can be used from January 1 to 7/31, so long as they're more than 300 feet from a water source. And then from August 1st to 12/31, no trail cameras in the field.
Commissioner Holmberg.
I mean, if we can add some additional language to the addressing the technology to their proposal, I think, you know, we got very
That's kind of what I was getting at. We need to go through some of that, and then we also have the exemptions, because there were some suggestions to remove some, but then also Commissioner Barnes, I know there was discussion on not removing D. So we kind of need to maybe step through this and give some direction so that we have something coming back to us in January so we don't leave something out, I guess is what I'm concerned with. And some of the details here. So I think one of the first ones that I'm seeing is the distance, because what's presented to us is 200 feet, and the discussion that I've heard so far has been 300 to match up with the camping. And then do we want to do anything about the the game locating device, I believe was the terminology, or do we want to leave it where we're at?
You know, I was kind of thinking in a lot of the trapping regulations, we have trap, snare, or similar device. That's the language. So I was wondering if you went back at the draft language, if it would be, one, a person shall not place, maintain, or use a trail camera or any other similar device if the camera or device transmits or is capable of transmitting images or location data. That's a blanket prohibition. Then the second prohibition is within 300 feet of a spring, water source, and then the language is artificial basin, which is used by wildlife and collects or designed to collect water. From January 1st to July 31st, and then an absolute prohibition on trail cams or similar devices, whether they are or are not capable of transmitting information from August 1 to 12/31. And then as far as the exemptions, I certainly think that we need to maintain an exemption for people acting within their official capacities, whether that be law enforcement or the department. I would be comfortable removing the blanket exemption for wildlife conservation organizations, just because I think that's a whole can of worms. And then I would keep the private property exemption. And I tend to agree with the comments of Mr. Lytle that if someone has a water trough out on public land where they have a lease or allotment or whatever it may be, and they put it there to monitor their livestock use in that would be covered by the private property exemption.
In reading that, you're referring to C, Commissioner Johnston?
I was, and then I think you would not need D, the exemption for D.
I think we may need a little more clarification, or just to rewrite C about private property, because the way it's written, the way I read it, it looks to me like it's just referring to land used on private property. And D is looks to me to be more specific to water improvements, stock tanks, pipelines, troughs. That's why I asked Chief Turnipseed that question, because I thought that D was more specific to that, and it wasn't clear enough in C to me.
I agree with Commissioner Barnes. I think we either need to rework C a little bit or we need to leave D there, because the water permit, which is private property per se, but it's more of a piece of paper than the actual land, correct?
What if we added to C a trail camera placed, maintained, or used on private property, or to monitor the use by livestock of any source of water? Because if someone's out there and they said, well, I put this out there to monitor livestock, and you say, and they don't own any cattle, then I think their argument then is not well taken.
Yeah, I thought about that too, but then as I read through it, I thought the language is already there. And I think it's specific to two separate things. And I mean, we could do it either way, but the way it's written, it's already there. And so by the time we make the changes to C, we're really not changing a lot of.
You know, I think I can live with D just because of the way the owner of the camera has to own the permit to appropriate the water, and they're using it to monitor livestock. That's a pretty narrow group of people.
See, that's what when I looked at it again, that's what I like. That's why I think it's just leave it in the way they have it written.
And then I guess on 3, we should obviously add verbiage, not only for the imagery again, but also the location for the trail camera, if that's what we want to call it.
And my idea would be a next draft would go beyond just a simple definition of what trail cameras are today and try to capture, yeah, I mean, we're going from things that are transmitting GPS data and location and time date a whole lot more than just pictures.
I think the only other thing we really haven't discussed is the Nevada Mining Association. I don't have a burning desire to necessarily do that because I do think that that could probably be back in with the private property or the water source situation. I don't know about monitoring livestock, but they would be monitoring a water source that they most likely have some sort of a permit to use. Would that not be true?
Yes, I think so. How's that?
I'm reaching there, but I just, Commissioner McNinch, do you have some?
Well, I guess along with the Mining Association, are we dropping off the concept of running stuff through the department, similar to their scientific collection permits? You know, I really do like that suggestion, and you know, I think that largely, I mean, you know, working at the health district, we have things come through asking for exemptions, and we get all sorts of things, and you know, a lot of them are pretty easy to, because the focus is pretty narrow on what its intent was, so a lot of them are pretty easy to filter out, and then you're left with Nevada Mining Association, the high school kid trying to do a project, wildlife organization trying to monitor a guzzler they built, something like that, and you know, you can, I think it's a real doable thing, to be honest with you, and it seems like the department has a structure in place to handle that with a tweak here and there or whatever, and it doesn't have to be, you know, we don't have, the department doesn't have to be in a position where they have to review thousands of these things or manage 1,000 of them, I guess. So this just seems like something that could fit into that if we included, well, I hate to say other category, but you know, that there's an opportunity for people to do this if they have a permit through the department, and then administratively work that out through the department.
But I think to do that, we would have to have something within this section that points someone that direction, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Be a.
Could we have a, well, let me add, could you have an E exception that the provisions of paragraph B of subsection 1 do not apply to, then you have a person who obtains a permit from the Department of Wildlife to use trail cameras?
Director Wasley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess my preference would be to try to take care of it in regulation. Certainly if we can't accomplish that, then we would look at creating additional in-house capabilities. As I look at 2A and then the three provisions under this exception, the provisions of paragraph B of subsection 1 do not apply to a person who is acting within the scope of his or her official duties, who has clearly marked each camera to be used to indicate ownership, and who is 1, 2, and 3, perhaps a number 4 could be an employee of an industry or group that has coordinated with the department, and that coordination could take shape in many different ways, and we could kick that around a little bit, and that's kind of akin to some of the language that came up on artificial water developments out of this past legislative session. There was a requirement for coordination with the Department of Wildlife and the state engineer for creation and development of those waters, and I don't know that we know exactly what that coordination looks like. We envisioned it to be kind of an approval process, but it doesn't paint us into a corner, but still provides the flexibility for us to, I guess, create opportunities for individuals who don't fall within 1, 2, or 3 right now.
Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you. So, Tony, there probably isn't much more direction that we need to give. I mean, you guys have an idea of where we're at, so maybe is that sufficient to, you guys could just come back with what seems to work best with the system and go from there?
Yeah, we can have further conversations with DAG, with LCB. We can look at some of that language that came out of this past session relative to water developments and that coordination, collaboration clause. We can look at regulations around scientific collection, see how that might best be accomplished, and if there's a couple options, bring those forward, put those out for public comment, and bring them back to this board.
Chief Turnipseed.
Thank you, Chairman Wallace. Yeah, exactly as Director Wasley said, I think we could work with the groups at hand, the representative from the Mining Association, and figure that out. It is noteworthy, though, that since this regulation was off of the agenda for so long, we are going to run up against a timeline. It'll expire around March 1st if we don't have it on the Legislative Commission's agenda by then. I think we'd still be okay as far as you know, getting it back to action item in January, but if we don't have it completed by March, it'll expire and we'd have to start all over from square one.
Okay, well, I think we'll look towards getting it on the January agenda for an action item. Anything further? Commissioner Hubbs?
The only, it's more of an enforcement issue. So outside of these seasons, you're going to be driving around. You might see a trail camera in the wrong place. So you're going to go over the trail camera. You're going to look at it, and it needs to indicate ownership. But I don't really know. What if it's John Doe? Shouldn't it have contact information or contact something, or is it just their name?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Wallace and Commissioner Hubbs. That is a good point that, you know, at some point we would need to specify what ownership information is. Yeah, if it just says John Doe, it doesn't seem like it would be sufficient, but, you know, I don't know if we want to go so far into the weeds as to specify name and phone number or something like that. It's a good question. If it just says John Doe, I don't think that constitutes ownership information. If there is a name, then we can usually, you know, cross-reference that to see if that person has a tag or look them up in our databases. But yeah, what ownership information is, I don't know if that's defined anywhere. I don't know if it'd be worth changing the term ownership information to name and phone number, or I don't think people would want to put an address on them, but.
Yeah. They all have someone else's name on them. Further comments from the commission or questions for the department before we move on? You guys think you have everything you need to proceed?
I think so. Jordan?
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you, Chief Turnipseed. We'll close agenda item number 7. Move to agenda item number 8, Commission Policy 27, Protection of Nevada Wildlife Resources, second reading, Commissioner Administrative Procedures, Regulation and Policy. Committee Chairman David McNinch and Game Division Administrator Brian Wakeling for possible action. Commission will conduct a second reading of Commission Policy 27 and may take action to officially revise and adopt the policy. Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Commission Policy 27, second reading, and this is the policy where there was pretty broad agreement to broaden a lot of the language that was in the policy. At the last meeting in Vegas, the Commission did vote to make one adjustment to what was was included in there, but to kind of validate that the Commission would like to keep it in there, and that had to do with the number 9. It is a policy of the Commission to oppose a population of wolves in Nevada. So that really was the primary issue with Policy 27, and we're back here. I don't think anything else out of that. Brian, did you have anything else you wanted to add? Or
Questions from the Commission? Okay, seeing none, we'll take it out to public comment in Las Vegas.
No public comment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Public comment in Carson City?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Mike Turnipseed. I'm with the Douglas Cab. Under number 5, wild horses and burros are a big issue in Douglas County. And so we thought the federal government retains public trust and management authority for specific types of wildlife, such as certain migratory birds under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and federally listed species under the Endangered Species Act. We thought you ought to add something about wild horses and burros.
Thank you, Mr. Turnipseed. Further public comment in Carson City? Okay, seeing none, we'll bring it back to the commission for further discussion or a motion. Any discussion on the wild horses?
I'm just trying to remember, is it called the Wild Horses and Burros Act? Is
Wild horse and free roaming, no, I'm going to pull it up.
Okay, because we should probably just get the legislation right, and I can't remember it offhand. Well, yeah, I'll just make a comment. Yeah, our last, the last round, I did vote no on this policy, and the reason I did so, just again for the record, was that number 9, I didn't understand such a strong stance on naturally occurring wolf populations. I just felt that that was an odd stance to take if we're here to protect wildlife, hold it into trust. To me, that applies to all wildlife that's here naturally, and I don't agree with taking some stance against one species for ancillary reasons. I don't understand that perspective, but I understand that the commission in total has that stance, but for that reason alone, I voted against this policy written in this form and draft.
Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I voted against it last time as well. But I did want to make the statement that I do appreciate that the broadening of the policy in general. I think that's a good revision of the policy, and you know, that's kind of what's driving my I won't be supporting it as well, because you know, I don't have an issue with coming out and saying we're not going to reintroduce wolves or you know, things of that standpoint, but I felt that it was a little bit counterproductive to what we'd the broadening of the policy that we'd made to be real so hardline on one species. So that's where I'm at.
Thank you, Commissioner McNinch. Further comments from the commission? Vice Chairman Johnston, did you come up with that title yet?
Yeah, it's the Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971, but my memory seems that there was an amendment to that after 1971, or I might be wrong. I can't remember. There was like 2 congressional acts on horses and burros, and I just can't remember if the 1971 was the most recent.
Should we take a short break, or?
Well, I guess my question is what type of addition would people want to this policy in that regard? And I guess that might go to Mr. Turnipseed. I mean, was there a specific language that you guys wanted to see in the policy?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Johnston, no, just that it's one of the important federal acts that is just as important as the Migratory Bird Act and the what was the other one? Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the ESA.
And so we could put a statement in there, would you, I guess, something along the lines of the federal government retains regulation over feral horses and burros pursuant to the Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971.
Sure.
Further comments or questions?
I would just say I like that addition. One of the reasons why is one of the comments or questions I often get asked by members of the public is, why doesn't the Wildlife Commission do something about the number of feral horses in Nevada? And I said, well, there's this federal law out there that precludes the Wildlife Commission and other state agencies from doing certain things with respect to certain horse and burro populations. So I think that making an addition to this policy is a well-received comment from the Douglas Cab.
Do I have that in the form of a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I'd move to adopt policy number 27 as presented with the following addition to add to item number 5, the following: the federal government retains regulatory authority over feral horses and burros pursuant to the Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971.
Second.
I have a motion by Commissioner Johnston with a second by Commissioner Barnes to approve Commission Policy 27 as presented with the addition to number 5 as stated by Commissioner Johnston. Any questions on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Motion passes 7-2 with Commissioners McNinch and Hubbs the no votes. So we'll close agenda item number 8, move to agenda item number 9, Commission Policy 65, Designation of Wildlife Management Areas, second reading. Commissioner and APRP Committee Chairman David McNinch and Habitat Division Administrator Alan Janae. For possible action, the Commission will conduct a second reading of Commission Policy 65 and may take action to officially revise and adopt the policy. Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is our second reading. In Vegas, the proposed Policy 65 was moved forward here without edits. It's mostly a cleanup and an editorial, kind of modernizing the policy, and it's presented to us as it was in Vegas. So.
Questions from the Commission? Seeing none, I'll take it out to public comment in Las Vegas on Commission Policy number 65.
No public comment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Las Vegas. Public comment on Commission Policy 65 in Carson City. Okay, seeing none, I'll bring it back to the Commission for further discussion or motion. Commissioner McNinch.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to approve Policy 65, Designation of Wildlife Management Areas as presented.
I have a motion by Commissioner McNinch and a second by Commissioner Valentine to approve Commission Policy 65 as presented. Any questions on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call for the question. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously, 9-0. We'll close agenda item number 9, move to agenda item number 10, Commission Policy 26, reestablishing, introducing, transplanting, and managing pioneering Rocky Mountain elk, first reading. Commissioner and APRP Committee Chairman David McNinch and Game Division Administrator Brian Wakeling for possible action. The Commission will conduct a first reading of Commission Policy 26 and may take action to revise the policy. The Commission may advance the policy to a second reading for possible adoption at a future meeting.
Thank you,
Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the committee, I'll let Brian go through a little bit of the details on what they've done, again, kind of a modernization of what's going on with elk management. But what you see in front of you is what was approved by the committee to bring forward as a first reading. So I'll let Brian go through some details.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner McNinch. If you look at the last date that this particular policy had been updated, it's been almost 2 decades. And so a lot of the information in here was fairly dated. And so largely this is an effort to go through, update it, clarify it, and make certain that we're addressing the issues that are more pertinent today. As it was written back in when it was early drafted, especially the first draft, 1988, it was very tied to a lot of the recent history that had occurred during the adoption of the policy, and looking at a lot of the efforts that were going on, both regarding pioneering and introducing elk throughout the state of Nevada. As we were looking at the revisions to this particular policy, there's a, we could either take the history and make it very succinct, or we could take the history and make it very voluminous. There's an awful lot of history that was missing from this. Part of the problem of having the history and part of the policy, especially when you start to get decades, excuse me, decades of history in it, is that it becomes very dated, or the need to revise it actually comes up rather rapidly as things start to develop. Within the last 2 years, we've developed a new sub-plan for the Humboldt Elk Management Plan. And so a lot of this history is actually encapsulated within those management plans and within the sub-plans. And so the management history really wasn't so much of an importance to this particular policy, we didn't believe. But we wanted to speak specifically to the potential for the management and the potential pioneering of additional elk herds. There's nothing within this policy as it's rewritten that changes the if we choose to introduce another species that's still, or the elk to another habitat that still resides within the Commission's purview to do that. If a population should pioneer, it also remains within the Commission's purview, to retain that population, manage that population, or eliminate it. And then some of the other pages 2 and 3, a lot of that just kind of cleans up when the department was a division at the time and how it's changed now to reflect the department's status.
Questions for Mr. Wakeling? Commissioner East?
Hi, thank you, Brian. Just one quick question, and Washoe County actually in their report asked that we keep the history in the back under a history section. And you said it's in the management plan, so I'm wondering, will it always live in the management plan? Because I felt kind of the same way, like there was a lot of history that was being removed. And I understand cleaning it up for sake of ease and convenience.
Thank you. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner East. Having the history tied to the policy, it kind of becomes a little bit cumbersome, but we do have those. We do have a management plan. It's also relatively dated, the overall species management plan, but each of the sub-plans are updated as we go through that. The policies really aren't a good place to try and retain that history from our perspective. We think there's better locations for that, and I think the plans speak to those.
Okay, just so that I can report back to them. Thank you.
Further questions or comments from the commission? I'll take it out for public comment in Las Vegas.
Not understanding this. No public comment in Las Vegas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Las Vegas. Public comment in Carson City? Okay, seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission for further discussion or a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to approve Policy 26, Managing Rocky Mountain Elk Populations in Nevada. I'm sorry, I make a motion to move Policy 26, Managing Rocky Mountain Elk Populations in Nevada, to a second reading.
Second. I have a motion by Commissioner McNinch and with a second by Commissioner East. And a question by Commissioner Barnes.
Could we allow some discussion before we vote? I received a lot of dialogue on this specific policy. And Commissioner McNish, you were recognized before I could make my comments. Anyway, a lot of the comments I received were from people who have been impacted by elk in the northern part of our county, and thought that we needed to add some language in there as to the effects of private interests. And so I guess I'm going to go through and maybe make the suggestions that we talked about, this individual and I think we all have a pretty good idea he still has an interest in what's going on this commission. Anyway, in the first paragraph under purpose, it is in the, I guess it'd be the last sentence, where it says established land use plans, comma, private land impacts, public review in concurrence with the Board of Wildlife Commissioners, adding in private land impacts. And then the next one we had was in the first sentence under policy. It says this policy is established to guide the department and inform the land management agencies, private interests, and the public on the management of elk pioneering populations.
Commissioner Barnes, could you?
Oh, okay, it'd be on page
Bottom,
2
I see
at the
it.
bottom on policy. All it is just includes them basically in the discussion and what's going on.
I guess maybe what I'm wondering here is just for point of order, if we could withdraw the.
I'll be glad to withdraw my initial motion.
Okay, is the second willing to withdraw the second as well? Yes. Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and continue this discussion then.
Okay, and then let's see. And then I think we go down to number 5 under policy. And it says, if in the best professional judgment of the department and after consideration of private property impacts and public access, an elk population successfully colonizes. Because a lot of the issues we're having, or we've just talked about in our area, is we have these large elk populations now, and we're wanting to hunt them, and access is an issue. And really, before there was an established population, there was no access before. Well, I mean, a lot of this access stuff we talk about, it seems like it's recent access issue. Well, no, there was no access before. So as we go down the road considering these, maybe we need to look at these access issues and stuff before we get to this point. They're included in the conversation. I think, then on background in the first sentence, the word extirpated. Obviously, we both agreed that we liked the way the first sentence, the way it was, or the first 2 sentences, the way they were written the first time before the corrections, because this person I talked to said, what the heck does extirpated mean anyway? So yeah, so that's that was our reworking of the policy. Other than that, everything was great.
Vice
Mr.
Chairman
Secretary, can you define extirpated for us?
I sure can. Extirpated is basically a local extinction. Extinct means gone everywhere all the time, and extirpation is like a local extinction. So the idea that they were still numerous, perhaps in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but non-existent in Nevada, makes extirpated a more appropriate term than extinct. I do have a question for Commissioner Barnes relative to his comment on number 5 on page 3. The way that I read that, it says, if in the best professional judgment of the department, an elk population successfully colonizes previously unoccupied habitat. So we're talking about a pioneering population. For example, Humboldt County, the department will apprise the commission and recommend an appropriate course of action. Is it the course of action that the department is recommending that should include considerations of access? Is that the
Yes, that's the intent, that all this needs to be considered, or needs to be part of the consideration.
Okay, thank you.
So if you can reword that better for the intent, but that's the intent, is that this is all included in the consideration.
Comments or questions from the commission?
So, Commissioner Barnes, there was a change under the purpose last sentence, consideration of established land use plans, private land impacts, comma, public review. Then the first sentence under the heading policy at the bottom of page 2, this policy is established to guide the department and inform the land management agencies, private land interests, comma, and the public on the management of elk. And then in paragraph number 5 under policy, it would be department will apprise the commission and recommend an appropriate course of action, giving due consideration to private land interests and public access.
Yeah, that'd work. Tony, does that work for you, or you want to change that a little bit?
No, that's fine, thank you. That's kind of exactly what I did, just added a clause at the end with full consideration of public access or other private land impacts.
Okay.
I could make that a motion.
I mean, I'd be glad. I mean,
I'd make a motion to approve policy 26 as presented with the following changes: the inclusion of private land impacts in the last sentence under purpose, so that it would read, pioneering elk populations will be managed in consideration of established land use plans, private land impacts, comma, public review, and concurrence by the Board of Wildlife Commissioners. That the first sentence under policy would read, this policy is established to guide the department and inform the land management agencies, comma, private land interests, comma, and the public on the management of elk. And then paragraph 5 under policy, we would add to the end of that policy statement, giving due consideration to private land interests and public access.
Second.
I have a motion by Vice Chairman Johnson and a second by Commissioner McNinch to approve the first reading of Commission Policy number 26 and move it to for adoption. Is that correct? With the changes stated.
With the changes stated.
Is everyone clear with the motion? I'll call for the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes unanimously, 9-0. We'll close agenda item number 10, move to agenda item number 11. Review of Commission Policy 3, Appeals, first reading, Commissioner and APRP Committee Chairman David McNinch for possible action. The Commission will conduct a first reading of Commission Policy 3 and may take action to revise the policy. The Commission may advance the policy to a second reading for possible adoption at a future meeting. Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is Policy 3, pretty straightforward, a couple of minor edits. There was some discussion, and I'll ask Dag Woodbury to step in if he feels inclined to, but there was question originally on, and it came up at our last meeting where we had our appeal, do we allow public comment or not? And the AG's office is basically telling us at this point that that is, the way that the policy is written is accurate, that we do not need to take public comment during the appeal hearing. Oh, there's Ag Stockton too, I didn't see.
There were some changes to the open meeting law, and they were going to adjust how they did that, but this policy is correct now with how the open meeting law has been interpreted by the Attorney General's office.
Questions from the commission? Seeing none, I will take it out for public comment in Las Vegas on agenda item number 11.
Thank you. No comment in Las Vegas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Las Vegas. I'll bring it back to Carson City for public comment on agenda item number 11. Okay, seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission for for further discussion or a motion. Commissioner McNinch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll make a motion to move Commission Policy 3 appeals to a second reading as presented.
I'll second that. I have a motion by Commissioner McNinch and a second by myself to move Commission Policy 3 appeals to a second reading at a future meeting. Questions on the motion? I'll call for the question. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion passes unanimously, 9-0. Close agenda item number 11. Move to agenda item 12. Wildlife Trust Fund Semi-Annual Report. Deputy Director Liz O'Brien, informational. The report will be provided on the investment and expenditure of the money in the Wildlife Trust Fund for the period of July 1st, 2016 to July 1st, 2017 pursuant to NRS 501.3585. Ms. O'Brien.
Thank you, Chairman Wallace and members of the Commission. I believe you have, for the record, Deputy Director Liz O'Brien, I believe you have the report of the status of the Wildlife Trust Fund in your packets. We're required to submit semi-annually to the Commission a report of the money in the Wildlife Trust Fund pursuant to NRS 501.3585. This report that you have is for the fiscal year 2017, which is July 1, 2016 through June 30th, 2017. The department received $326,950.44 in donations and expended $284,724.80. Attached to the report is a detail of every gift that we received during that time period. Donations are received from a variety of conservation organizations, industry, and private citizens in support of the department. These donations save state funds, mostly sportsmen's revenue, and in many instances can be used as match for federal dollars at a rate of up to $3 for every one donated. Is there any questions?
Questions for Ms. O'Brien? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll close agenda item number 12, move to agenda item 13, Public Works Contracts, Deputy Director Liz O'Brien, informational. A report will be provided on public work contracts awarded by the department in the previous year. Ms. O'Brien.
Thank you. For the record, Liz O'Brien, Deputy Director. This one you don't have in your packet because originally when I began to write the report, I only had one to report on, but then I did a little research on the history of our what are called 338 contracts, and I found 5. So I'm going to go ahead and just read them to you. The Department of Wildlife administers its own public work contracts, which per SAM 0326, which is the state admin manual, are not required to go for approval before the State Board of Examiners. In order to be transparent, we report to the Commission agenda once a year the contracts awarded for projects that have been worked on. So starting with the most recent, it was April 17th of 2017, MKD Construction, for $12,900. This was for the purchase and installation of base to be put down at the NDOW region, Western Region office in the back parking lot, which was kind of a muddy mess, and we put that down and made it not so muddy. On October 4th, 2017, Shell Creek Construction for $135,810 and that contract is currently in process, and that's to repair the masonry stem wall at the NDOW Western Region office in Fallon. October 9th, 2017, Brymont Construction for $18,275. This was to remodel bathrooms and refinish floors at the Key Pittman WMA. January 6th, 2016, Silver Sabre Electric for $59,500. That one was for Lake Mead Hatchery electrical improvements, such as repairs to the building alarm system and installing aeration pumps in the lower raceways so that the fish could get stronger. June 28, 2016, Innovative Access for $13,557. That was for Laughlin Gate repairs. That's all I have. Do you have any questions?
Questions for Ms. O'Brien? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
Close agenda item number 13 and move to agenda item number 14, public comment period. Persons wishing to speak are requested to complete a speaker's card and present it to the recording secretary. No action can be taken by the commission at this time. Any item requiring commission action may be scheduled on a future commission agenda. We'll start with public comment in Las Vegas.
This is Stephanie Myers, Las Vegas. I'd just like to thank the commission and the department for the video conferencing that we've had today. I think it's wonderful for governmental transparency, and also if it continues on a regular basis to encourage public participation in what happens here at the Wildlife Commission, which should be one of the major goals of the commission. So I thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Myers. Further public comment in Las Vegas?
No, Mr. Chairman, that concludes comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Las Vegas. Public comment in Carson City. Okay. Seeing none, we will...
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Director Wasley.
If I might, for the record, I'd like to extend some gratitude to Commissioner Almberg for his efforts in helping us to maintain some of our infrastructure at the Cave Lake Dam. He went above and beyond and donated significant equipment, know-how, and time. It didn't come up in our capital improvement project report, but we're very appreciative of his efforts out there and just wanted to acknowledge him on the record. So thank you, Commissioner Almberg.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Commissioner Almberg. So we'll stand adjourned until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.